The world is littered with places that time could not quite erase. A mosaic of silent ruins, half-remembered towns, and empty streets where stories linger like mist at dawn. Fields reclaim villages, forests swallow factories, and deserts consume cities, yet the marks of human ambition refuse to vanish. Join me as we explore the abandoned and the uncanny, where every broken window and crumbling wall hints at mysteries unsolved and lives unfinished. Centralia, Pennsylvania, the town that burned beneath its feet. A gentle breeze stirs the grass along Pennsylvania's Route 61, brushing against faded street signs and the crumbling skeletons of homes. The road itself is scarred, warped and split, bearing the marks of a force that cannot be seen but is always present, heat radiating from deep below. It's not the sun that warms this forgotten valley, but a fire that has burned beneath the earth for over 60 years. This is Centralia, once a bustling mining town, now a ghostly warning. The story of Centralia is not written in the annals of ancient history, nor is it far removed from the world we know. Its tale begins in the 19th century, as so many American tales do, with the promise of industry. Coal, specifically anthracite, was the fuel of choice. The black gold that powered the locomotives heated the homes and drove the factories of a growing nation. In the 1850s, prospectors discovered a vast seam of this precious resource beneath what would soon become Centralia. The town's destiny was set. For decades, Centralia thrived. By the 1960s, it boasted a population of nearly 1,500. The streets were lined with churches and shops, the air thick with the clang and whistle of mining equipment. Residents spoke with pride of the close-knit community, where generations of families worked the mines and gathered at local diners after Sunday Mass. But beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively, danger was brewing. It was May 1962 when the sequence of events that would doom Centralia began. The town, like many others, maintained its landfill by burning trash. That year, the landfill was located in an abandoned strip mine just outside the town. The fire, which was intended to be a routine exercise, slipped into an unsealed coal seam. Almost immediately, the flames ignited the anthracite beneath the ground. The fire found fuel in the labyrinthine network of old mine tunnels, spreading unseen and largely unchecked. At first, few noticed. The fire smouldered quietly, mostly ignored. These things happened, and Centralia's mining history was dotted with small blazes. But this fire was different. It found passageways, veins of coal and pockets of methane gas, slowly spreading in all directions. Efforts to extinguish the blaze were half-hearted, hindered by bureaucratic confusion and a lack of resources. Some tried to dig it out, others to smother it with clay and slurry, but the fire was always one step ahead, moving deeper, feeding on the endless supply of fuel. Years passed, and the fire grew. Residents began to notice unusually warm basements, a faint smell of sulphur, and in winter, steam rising from cracks in the ground. By the 1970s, the fire was a local secret, but not yet a crisis. People adapted, as communities often do. Kids played near the wisps of smoke, and homeowners shrugged off the strange warmth as a quirk of living in a mining town. That changed in 1979, when a gas station owner noticed that the temperature of the gasoline in his underground tanks had soared to dangerous levels. When checked, the reading was 172 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to risk explosions. The following year, the ground quite literally opened up. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski fell into a sudden sinkhole in his backyard, a pit exhaling poisonous carbon monoxide. He clung to a tree root and was pulled to safety, but the incident made national headlines. Centralia's secret was out. From that point, Centralia's fate was sealed. State and federal authorities descended on the town, measuring gas levels, testing the soil, and mapping the silent spread of the fire. The numbers were grim. The subterranean blaze could not be contained. The ground was unstable, the air toxic. Centralia was declared unsafe. For the residents, the announcement was both a shock and a heartbreak. Some refused to believe that the danger was real, certain that the government was exaggerating. Others, their children coughing from the fumes, packed up and left. The government offered buyouts. Eventually, more than $40 million was spent relocating the bulk of the population. Homes were razed, leaving empty lots and meandering roads to nowhere. By the end of the 1980s, Centralia's post office closed, and its zip code was officially revoked. Those who stayed, The so-called holdouts became legendary. They resisted eviction, fought court battles, and clung to their homes as the world around them vanished. For years, a handful of residents lived among the ruins, tending gardens, keeping up their properties, and watching as their neighbours' houses were swallowed by the relentless progress of demolition. The landscape of Centralia is now almost otherworldly. In places, the earth is split by deep fissures, from which wisps of smoke and steam escape. In winter, the snow melts quickly on these patches, revealing scorched earth and patches of green moss thriving in the warmth. Trees grow at strange angles, their roots contorted by the shifting, unstable ground. The air is heavy with the metallic tang of sulphur, especially after a rain. Walking along the so-called graffiti highway, a stretch of abandoned Route 61 covered in neon spray paint and murals, there's a sense of trespass, as if one is moving through a landscape that does not belong to the living. The silence is profound, broken only by the occasional rumble of earth shifting beneath unseen flames. Centralia's church, St. Mary's, still stands on the hill, a solitary sentinel overlooking the ruins. Every year, former residents and their descendants return for a single mass, a ritual of memory for a town that no longer exists in any official capacity. The graveyards too remain, their stones sinking slowly into the warming ground. Strangely, despite the danger, Centralia has never been entirely empty. Wildlife has returned in force. Deer graze among the ruins, birds nest in the eaves of abandoned houses, and wildflowers bloom in the cracks of shattered pavement. The absence of people has created an accidental sanctuary, nature reclaiming what industry and fire have left behind. But the fire itself is the true inhabitant of Centralia. Scientists estimate that the blaze stretches for miles in every direction, consuming hundreds of acres of coal. The temperature in the burning veins can reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Projections suggest that, barring intervention, the fire could burn for another 250 years, long after the last human memory of Centralia fades. The story of Centralia is not unique in the world, but its scale and the drama of its abandonment have made it a symbol. It is a testament to the dangers that lurk beneath the surface, literal and metaphorical. The town's fate was shaped by a century of digging, extraction and disregard for the hidden forces below. The fire is a reminder that the earth remembers every wound, and sometimes it responds in ways that humans cannot control or predict. Centralia's legacy lives on in popular culture. The town inspired the eerie, fog-shrouded setting of the Silent Hill video game and film franchise, and countless urban explorers and curiosity seekers make the pilgrimage each year to photograph the desolation. Yet there is little left to see. No shops, no bustling streets, no echo of children's laughter, only the wind, the smoke and the strange warmth that seeps up from the earth. What makes Centralia so compelling is not just the spectacle of its destruction, but the way it lingers in the imagination. It is a place where the boundary between above and below has dissolved, where the invisible becomes visible through heat and vapour. There is something ancient in its ruin, a reminder of the balance between humanity's ambition and the forces we unleash in pursuit of progress. Balestrino, Italy, the silent watcher on the hillside. The flashlight beam slices through the fog. Stunted olive trees crowd the hillside, their gnarled roots gripping the earth as if holding on for dear life. Somewhere behind, the hum of an engine fades away. In the half-light, the outlines of Balestrino materialise. Abandoned walls, a crumbling bell tower, archways leading to nowhere. For the explorer, whether a curious traveller, a filmmaker, or a descendant retracing family footsteps, this is the threshold of a world left behind. "Don't go after dark," the innkeeper warned. "The ground is not what it used to be." He said it with a half smile, but his eyes darted to the hills, as if expecting them to move. The village stands as it did when the last doors were shut for good in the early 1960s. Stone houses, their windows gaping, the church battered but defiant, a castle presiding over the emptiness. But where most ruins are the result of war or disaster, Balestrino's undoing crept up over centuries, quiet, unpredictable, and unstoppable. You step over a fallen shutter, brushing aside wild fennel, and peer into a house where a rusted stove and a child's shoe remain, as if their owners might return any moment. The silence isn't total. The air vibrates with the memory of voices, a spectral echo of daily life. The ground shifts slightly underfoot, a subtle reminder that the earth here is always in motion. A journal entry, left by a 21st century explorer and found online, recounts, "There's a strange tension under the beauty. You hear rocks shifting, birds scattering, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. It feels alive, but not for people anymore. To understand Balestrino, you must see it as a palimpsest, each generation layering its story atop the last. The oldest records note a fortified hamlet, first mentioned in the 11th century, growing under the protection of the Del Carretto family. The castle, once a bulwark against invaders, became a symbol of permanence that would prove tragically ironic. Villages endured medieval wars, pirate raids, Napoleonic conscriptions. Yet their true adversary was always beneath their feet. The Ligurian Apennines, with their fractured limestone and hidden springs, shifted unpredictably. Many villages in the region suffered landslides and tremors, but in Balestrino, the instability was relentless, never catastrophic, just insidious. The medieval streets wind between houses built from the same pale stone as the mountains themselves. Each home was constructed with care, stones fitted perfectly, foundations dug deep into what seemed like solid rock. The church of San Giorgio rose in the village centre, its bell tower a beacon visible from the valley below. For centuries, life here followed the rhythms of the seasons. Olive harvests, religious festivals, the slow succession of births, marriages and deaths that mark the passage of generations. In a recorded interview from the 1990s, an elderly woman, Julia, who left Balestrino in her 20s, recalls, "The well would fill with earth overnight. Sometimes after rain we'd hear a sound like thunder, but it was the land moving, not the sky. My father was always patching cracks. He joked that the house wanted to walk to the sea." The signs were always there, but they accumulated so gradually that each new crack, each shifted stone could be explained away as the natural settling of old buildings. Families had lived in these houses for generations, their ancestors had weathered earthquakes and storms. Why should this generation be different? Photos from the 1940s show wedding parties and festivals, the piazza filled with laughter. Children play in the shadow of the castle walls, women hang laundry from wrought iron balconies, and men gather in the evening light to discuss the day's work. But in those same years, official letters speak of requests for aid. The street by the church has sunk again. We beg for funds to shore the foundations. Engineers came, measured, made plans. They reinforced walls, installed drainage systems and shored up the most precarious buildings. But each intervention was temporary. The village's bones were shifting inch by inch, year by year. What had taken centuries to build was being undone by forces that no amount of human ingenuity could permanently arrest. The 1950s brought a new urgency to the problems. Heavy rains would turn the narrow streets into torrents, carrying away loose stones and undermining foundations. The sound of cracking masonry became a constant backdrop to daily life. Families began to speak in hushed tones about cracks that appeared overnight, about rooms that seemed to shrink as walls slowly converged. For Balestrino, there was no single day of the end. Instead, the exodus unfolded in slow motion. The population dwindled as families moved to safer ground just downhill or left for the coast. The young departed first, seeking opportunities in Italy's growing cities. The old remained, tending gardens that grew more precarious each season, maintaining houses that seemed determined to return to the earth. By the 1950s, only the most stubborn remained, patching the walls, watching for new fissures after every rainstorm. A local historian describes the final weeks. One morning the bakery was closed, then the grocer. When the church bells rang for the last time, most of us had already packed. It wasn't a disaster. It was surrender. The last residents left, quietly, without fanfare or official ceremony. They locked their doors, gathered what possessions they could carry, and walked down the hillside to begin new lives on more stable ground. Behind them, Balestrino fell silent for the first time in nearly 1,000 years. Today wild boars root through gardens where tomatoes and herbs once grew. Ivy strangles balconies that once displayed geraniums in terracotta pots. Swallows nest where children once played hide and seek among the narrow alleyways. The land left to itself is not peaceful. Every winter brings new collapses, slabs of roads sliding away, rooms filling with mud and debris. Yet the ruins are stubborn. The church of San Giorgio still stands, battered but upright, its bell tower visible from miles away. The castle's silhouette dominates the ridge, defying gravity and geology with an almost supernatural persistence. The streets, via Castello, via Antica, are now little more than paths for weeds and the occasional explorer, but they still follow the ancient routes that once connected home to church to market square. One travel blogger writes, "You feel watched in Balestrino, not by ghosts, but by the land itself. The houses are being slowly reclaimed, but they're not giving up without a fight." For decades, the ruins were off-limits, closed by the authorities as dangerously unstable. This, of course, only added to their allure. Filmmakers and photographers snuck in, drawn by the atmosphere of suspense and melancholy. Urban explorers traded maps and warnings online. Watch for unstable ground near the old bakery. Don't climb the bell tower after rain. Balestrino became a silent star, appearing in Italian horror films, art installations, and even music videos. Directors were drawn to its authentic decay, its genuine abandonment. Yet for all the images captured within its walls, the village remains elusive. Its essence is more felt than seen, more experienced than documented. The story of Balestrino is not just geology or architecture, it's a record of resilience, adaptation, and the bittersweet acceptance of loss. Locals in the new village below still tend the old cemetery, where weathered headstones mark generations of families who called the hilltop home. They gather for festivals honouring saints whose statues remain in the ruined church above, their painted eyes gazing out over empty pews. Children grow up hearing stories of the old days. "Nonna, did you really live up there?" "Yes, we had a cat named Tito and every morning he'd sit on the wall and watch the sea." "Will we go back?" "No, the land won't let us, but we remember." Geologists continue to monitor the hill with modern instruments that can detect movements measured in millimetres. Satellite images reveal subtle shifts, centimetres at a time, but relentless. Some optimists dream of stabilising the ruins and reopening them as a heritage site, but most accept that the village's fate is sealed. The earth here does not forgive, but neither does it forget. The instability that drove people away has also preserved Balestrino in ways that prosperity never could. Unlike so many Italian villages transformed beyond recognition by development or tourism, here, time stands genuinely still. There are no souvenir shops, no busloads of tourists snapping photos, just the hush of a place that exists between memory and reality. At dusk, as light leaks from the valley below, Balestrino seems to hover between worlds. The present fades, the echoes of laughter, prayers, and everyday conversations from centuries past become almost audible. The explorer, flashlight in hand, stands in a street where so many feet once hurried home for dinner and feels the vertigo of impermanence. How quickly what seems permanent can become memory. As the explorer picks away back down the hillside, following a path made treacherous by loose stones and hidden roots, the lights of the new Balestrino glimmer below. Life continues there. Births, meals, celebrations, in houses built on firmer ground just out of sight of the old village's ruined walls. Behind, the wind rises through empty doorways, and somewhere in the darkness another stone shifts, another fragment of the past settles deeper into the restless earth that refuses to stay still. Hashima Island, Gunkanjima, the fortress of coal. The ferry cuts through the choppy waters off Nagasaki, its engine churning against the currents that have guarded these waters for centuries. Passengers crowd the deck, cameras ready, but nothing prepares them for the first glimpse of Hashima Island rising from the sea like a concrete battleship. The nickname Gunkanjima, Battleship Island, seems almost inadequate for this hulking mass of grey that appears to have been hewn from a single block of stone and steel. From a distance, the island's silhouette is deceptively uniform, but as the ferry draws closer, the details emerge with startling clarity. Towering apartment blocks rise directly from the seawall, their windows dark and empty, while the skeletal remains of mining infrastructure pierce the skyline like the ribs of some massive beast. This is not a ruin that nature has softly reclaimed. This is industrial abandonment in its rawest form, a testament to humanity's capacity to build monuments to progress and then walk away. Hashima measures just 480 metres long and 160 metres wide, yet at its peak in 1959, it housed over 5,000 people, making it one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Every square metre of the island was utilised, from the coal shafts that plunged deep beneath the seafloor to the rooftop gardens where children played in the shadow of smokestacks. The island was a world unto itself, a concrete ecosystem where 3 generations of families lived, worked, and died without ever setting foot on the mainland. The story begins in 1887 when Mitsubishi Corporation purchased the island and discovered the rich seams of coal that lay beneath the ocean floor. What started as a small mining operation quickly evolved into something unprecedented: Japan's first major concrete structure, a fortress of industry rising directly from the waves. The company didn't just extract coal from Hashima, they transformed it into a symbol of Japan's rapid modernization, a place where traditional ways of life were abandoned in favor of industrial efficiency. The miners who came to Hashima were not just workers but pioneers of a new way of living. They descended into shafts that extended over a kilometre beneath the sea, working in conditions of crushing heat and constant danger. The coal they extracted powered Japan's steel mills and factories, fueling the nation's emergence as an industrial power. Above ground, their families lived in apartment blocks that rose story upon story, each unit identical to the next, each balcony overlooking the endless ocean. Life on Hashima followed the rhythms of the mine. The wail of sirens marked the changing of shifts, and the elevator that carried miners to the depths also brought up the coal that sustained the island's economy. Every resident, from the company executives in their comfortable apartments to the labourers in the deepest tunnels, understood that their existence depended entirely on the black seams buried beneath the seafloor. Yet for all its industrial purpose, Hashima developed its own culture and community. Children attended school in classrooms with panoramic ocean views, learning their lessons to the constant backdrop of mining machinery. The island had its own hospital, temples, movie theatre, and even a rooftop garden where vegetables grew in soil imported from the mainland. Residents spoke of the unique camaraderie that developed in such isolation, how neighbours became family, how the shared experience of living on this concrete outcrop created bonds that lasted lifetimes. The apartment buildings themselves were marvels of efficient design, each unit carefully planned to maximise space while providing basic comfort. Families lived in rooms that measured just a few tatami mats, yet these tiny spaces contained entire lives. Birth announcements, wedding photos, children's drawings stuck to walls that separated them from the ocean by mere metres. The buildings had no elevators, so residents climbed narrow staircases that echoed with the footsteps of thousands, carrying groceries, laundry, and the weight of daily existence up and down the concrete towers. Photographs from the 1950s and 1960s show a community in full swing. Children play in the narrow spaces between buildings, their laughter mixing with the industrial sounds that never ceased. Women hang laundry from every available balcony, creating colourful banners that flutter against the grey concrete. Men gather in the small shops and restaurants that occupied the ground floors, sharing drinks and stories after long shifts underground. The island hummed with activity, a beehive of human endeavour surrounded by the vastness of the sea. But beneath the surface prosperity, cracks were beginning to show. Japan's energy needs were changing, and petroleum was gradually replacing coal as the fuel of choice. The mine's productivity, once legendary, began to decline as the easily accessible seams were exhausted. Younger residents started leaving for opportunities on the mainland, drawn by the promise of jobs that didn't require descending into the darkness below the ocean floor. The end, when it came, was swift and decisive. In January 1974, Mitsubishi announced the closure of the mine, and within months the island was evacuated. Families who had lived on Hashima for generations packed their belongings and boarded ferries that would take them away forever. The exodus was orderly but heartbreaking, residents leaving behind not just homes, but an entire way of life that had defined their identity. The last resident left Hashima on April 20th, 1974, and the island fell silent for the first time in nearly a century. The concrete buildings that had sheltered thousands now stood empty, their windows staring out at the sea like countless hollow eyes. The machinery fell still, the voices faded, and only the sound of waves against the seawall remained to mark the passage of time. Abandonment transformed Hashima into something entirely different from what it had been during its industrial heyday. Without human maintenance, the salt air and typhoons began their relentless work of erosion. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, and the ocean spray gradually coated everything in a patina of rust and decay. The island became a monument to impermanence, a place where the dreams of industrial progress lay exposed to the elements. For decades, Hashima remained off-limits to visitors, accessible only to researchers and the occasional filmmaker drawn by its apocalyptic atmosphere. The island appeared in movies and documentaries as a symbol of industrial decay, its crumbling facades serving as a backdrop for stories about humanity's relationship with technology and progress. Yet these images, striking as they were, could only capture the surface of what Hashima represented. When limited tours finally began in 2009, visitors found themselves confronting not just ruins, but the physical remnants of lives lived in one of the most extreme environments humans have ever created. The concrete pathways where children once ran to school now crumble underfoot. The apartments where families shared meals overlook balconies where typhoon winds have scattered the debris of decades. The mine entrance, once the vital artery of the island's existence, is sealed and silent, its depths flooded with seawater. Walking through the accessible portions of Hashima today, visitors experience a peculiar form of time travel. The island exists in a permanent state of suspended animation, neither fully ruined nor preserved, but caught somewhere between past and future. The concrete structures, built to last, stubbornly resist complete collapse, creating a landscape that feels more like science fiction than historical reality. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of Hashima is not what it has become, but what it represents about human adaptability and the price of progress. The island stands as evidence of humanity's willingness to create entirely artificial environments in pursuit of economic goals, and the ease with which such environments can be abandoned when those goals change. The families who once called Hashima home built their lives around the promise that industrial progress was permanent, only to discover that even the most solid-seeming foundations can shift beneath the tides of economic change. The sea continues its patient work around Hashima, waves washing against concrete that grows more fragile with each passing storm. Slowly, inevitably, the ocean will reclaim what was taken from it, dissolving the dreams of industrial empire back into salt and memory. The battleship that once symbolized Japan's conquest of nature will eventually surrender to the forces that no amount of concrete and steel can permanently resist, leaving only stories carried away on the endless currents that connect all islands to the vast, patient sea. Fordlandia, Brazil, the jungle's indigestion. Imagine a vision born not of necessity or local wisdom, but of sheer industrial will. A dream conceived in the steel mills and assembly lines of Detroit, transplanted wholesale into the steaming, impenetrable heart of the Amazon rainforest. This is the improbable genesis of Fordlandia, a place that stands today as a monument to hubris, a ghostly echo of a clash between two utterly incompatible worlds. It wasn't gold or diamonds that drew Henry Ford, the titan of American industry, to the Brazilian Amazon in the late 1920s, it was rubber. As his automobile empire boomed, Ford needed vast quantities of rubber for tyres and parts. He was dependent on British-controlled plantations in Southeast Asia, and he detested being reliant on anyone, let alone foreign powers. His solution? Grow his own rubber, and not just any rubber, but enough to supply his entire global operation, grown under his direct control, implemented with his signature industrial efficiency. He acquired 2 vast tracts of land along the Tapajos River, a tributary of the Amazon, totaling over 2.5 million acres, an area larger than the state of Delaware. This wasn't just a plantation, it was meant to be a slice of idealized Americana in the tropics. Ford envisioned a town where his Brazilian workers would live like good Americans, complete with clapboard houses, manicured lawns, a hospital, schools, a golf course, and even square dances on Saturday nights. They would eat wholesome food, follow strict schedules, and embrace the values of hard work and industrial discipline. The scale of the ambition was breathtaking, perhaps even delusional. Ford sent ships loaded not just with machinery and supplies, but with prefab houses, fire hydrants, even a golf course roller. He was bringing Detroit to the jungle, literally and figuratively. The ships carried American-style streetlights that would illuminate paths through the rainforest, complete sets of dining room furniture for workers' homes, and thousands of yards of window screening and as if mere mesh could keep the Amazon at bay. What Ford's planners failed to grasp was that they were entering one of the most biodiverse and ecologically complex regions on Earth. The Amazon wasn't simply hot and humid, it was a living entity with its own rules, its own defences, and its own ways of rejecting foreign intrusions. The very soil beneath their feet was different from anything in Michigan or Ohio, thin and acidic, its nutrients locked in the living canopy above rather than stored in the earth below. But the Amazon is not a place that yields easily to blueprints drawn thousands of miles away. It is a realm of overwhelming life, of intricate ecosystems, of heat and humidity that press in on you, of insects and diseases that thrive in the relentless moisture. From the moment the first ships arrived, the project was plagued by problems that Ford's engineers, experts in steel and concrete, were utterly unprepared for. Clearing the dense jungle proved far more difficult and costly than anticipated. Machinery rusted in the humid air, parts broke down, and the thick vegetation seemed to grow back almost as quickly as it was cut down. The heat was oppressive, often reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels that made simple breathing an effort. Workers collapsed from heat exhaustion, and the rigid 8-hour shifts that worked so well in Detroit became instruments of torture in the Amazon. The imported American managers, many of whom had never left the United States, found themselves in a world they could barely comprehend. They insisted on wearing wool suits in the tropical heat, refusing to adapt their dress to the climate. They demanded that meals be served at precise times, regardless of the natural rhythms of the rainforest. One manager famously tried to establish a baseball diamond, only to discover that the infield was immediately colonized by army ants. And then there were the rubber trees themselves. Ford's plan involved planting thousands upon thousands of Hevea brasiliensis trees, the source of natural rubber, in dense uniform rows just like corn in a Michigan field. This monoculture approach, so successful in other parts of the world where natural predators were absent, was a fatal error in the Amazon, the rubber tree's native habitat. The jungle is home to a devastating fungus called South American leaf blight, Microcyclus eulae, which thrives in humid conditions and spreads rapidly through genetically similar trees planted close together. It was a biological weapon the rainforest deployed with silent, devastating efficiency. The irony was profound. Rubber trees had originally come from this very region before being smuggled to Asia in the 1870s by British botanist Henry Wickham. In their new Asian homes, free from their natural enemies, the trees thrived in plantations. But here in their birthplace, they remained vulnerable to the pathogens that had evolved alongside them for millennia. As Ford's vast plantations matured, the blight swept through them like wildfire, killing the trees before they could produce latex. The engineers tried everything, pruning, spraying, even attempting to graft resistant Asian varieties onto the local stock, but nothing worked on an industrial scale. They imported expensive fungicides from the United States, built elaborate irrigation systems, and even experimented with different planting patterns, all to no avail. The jungle's intricate biological defences had defeated the assembly line. The attempt to impose American culture on the Brazilian workers was equally disastrous, bordering on the absurd. Workers were expected to live in the prefab houses, which were designed for temperate climates and became sweltering ovens in the tropical heat. The houses had no proper ventilation for the Amazon climate, and their tin roofs amplified the heat to unbearable levels. Workers were required to eat American food like hamburgers, canned peaches and oatmeal in a cafeteria that served meals at precisely regulated times, regardless of local customs or preferences. The cultural misunderstandings were almost comical in their severity. Brazilian workers, accustomed to eating their largest meal in the middle of the day followed by a siesta, were forced to work through the hottest hours while eating light lunches of unfamiliar food. Alcohol was strictly forbidden, despite being a traditional part of social life in the region. Workers were expected to attend English-language movies and participate in square dances, activities that must have seemed utterly bizarre to people whose cultural traditions were rooted in centuries of Amazonian life. Ford's paternalistic vision extended to every aspect of daily life. Workers were given company-issued uniforms, had their living quarters inspected regularly, and were subjected to moral lectures about the virtues of American-style family life. The company even attempted to control what workers did in their spare time, organising wholesome recreational activities like softball games and community sing-alongs. Resentment simmered. The food was bland and insufficient by local standards. The hours were long and arduous. The rules felt arbitrary and insulting. In 1930, the simmering anger boiled over into a full-blown riot. Workers, fed up with the food and conditions, destroyed the cafeteria, overturned cars, and chased the American managers into the jungle. The Brazilian army had to be called in to restore order, a stark illustration of how deeply misunderstood the local culture and environment were. The riot became legendary in the region, known as the Quebra Panela, or pot-breaking uprising. Workers smashed dishes, destroyed furniture, and ransacked the managers' quarters. The American staff fled into the forest, some hiding for days before being rescued by Brazilian authorities. It was a humiliating moment that revealed the fundamental disconnect between Ford's industrial vision and Amazonian reality. Despite the mounting evidence of failure, Ford remained stubbornly committed to his vision. He poured more money into the project, replaced managers, and even attempted to move the operation to a new site, Belterra, further downriver, hoping a change of location might escape the blight. But the fungus followed, and the fundamental incompatibility of Ford's industrial model with the Amazonian reality remained. The second attempt at Belterra was even more elaborate, featuring wider streets, better housing, and more sophisticated agricultural techniques. Ford hired top agronomists and invested in research facilities. Yet the same problems persisted: the blight, the cultural resistance, the relentless humidity that destroyed equipment and sapped human energy. By the early 1940s, the project was clearly doomed. The blight was unbeatable on an industrial scale, and synthetic rubber, developed during World War II, was beginning to supplant natural latex. In 1945, after investing what would be equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today and receiving not a single drop of commercially viable rubber, Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, sold the entire operation back to the Brazilian government for a fraction of the cost, a mere $244,200. The Americans left, taking their vision of Detroit in the tropics with them. Fordlandia and Belterra were abandoned, left to the slow, inexorable embrace of the rainforest. Today, visiting Fordlandia is a journey into a strange, melancholic pocket of history. The town still exists, inhabited by a few hundred Brazilians who have slowly moved into the decaying structures. But much of it remains as it was left. Rows of identical clapboard houses, many collapsing under the weight of vines and moisture. The skeletal remains of the powerhouse and sawmill, their machinery rusting into oblivion. The water tower, a bizarre landmark rising above the jungle canopy, like a concrete lighthouse in a sea of green. Walking through the overgrown streets, you find fire hydrants that will never be used, sidewalks that lead into impenetrable thickets, and the ghostly outline of the golf course swallowed by dense vegetation. The hospital is still there, its tile walls stained, bats roosting in the rafters. The schoolhouse stands silent, desks covered in dust and leaves. There's even a cemetery where some of the American managers who died of tropical diseases lie buried, their headstones slowly being consumed by moss and lichen. The remnants of Ford's industrial dream persist in strange ways. Rusted machinery, parts emerge from the jungle floor like archaeological artifacts, and locals still find items in the forest. Tools, parts of cars, even furniture that were abandoned decades ago. Some of the original rubber trees, stunted and diseased, still produce small amounts of latex that local residents occasionally collect, an ironic postscript to Ford's failed industrial vision. Nature hasn't just returned to Fordlandia, it is actively digesting it. Roots crack through concrete foundations, vines tear apart walls, and the relentless humidity encourages decay at an astonishing rate. The sounds of the jungle, cicadas, birds, unseen animals, have replaced the whir of machinery and the distant echoes of square dance music. Fordlandia is more than just a failed business venture. It is a powerful symbol of the limits of industrial might and cultural imposition, a reminder that some places cannot be tamed, some visions cannot be transplanted, and that the earth, in its quiet, persistent way, always has the final say. The jungle endures, having absorbed and transformed yet another human dream into something stranger and more enduring than anything that could have been built according to plan. Kuldhara, India, the village that vanished in a single night. The desert wind carries secrets across the Thar, whispering through ruins that have stood empty for 2 centuries. But this is not the gradual abandonment of economic decline or the slow surrender to geological forces. This is something else entirely, a mystery that begins and ends in a single night, when an entire civilization simply chose to disappear. In 1825, Kuldhara was a thriving oasis settlement in Rajasthan, home to over 1,500 Palawal Brahmins who had transformed the arid landscape into a model of prosperity and innovation. Their advanced water conservation systems channeled precious moisture through underground channels. Their fields produced abundant crops despite the harsh climate, and their reputation for wisdom and learning attracted visitors from across the region. They had lived here for centuries, building not just homes, but a complete society that seemed as permanent as the desert itself. Then, on one night that history refuses to fully illuminate, they were gone. Every man, woman, and child vanished. Not killed, not captured, not driven away by invading armies, but voluntarily erased from existence, leaving behind a ghost town so complete in its abandonment that even their livestock had disappeared. The houses stood intact, doors left open, meals half prepared, but the people who had called this place home for generations had melted away like morning mist. What makes Kuldhara's abandonment so haunting is not what was destroyed, but what was preserved. Unlike settlements abandoned due to war or disaster, nothing here was broken or burned. The stone houses, built with the precision of master craftsmen, remain largely intact. Intricate water systems still wind beneath the streets, testament to engineering skills that allowed a city to flourish in one of India's most challenging environments. Yet despite this preservation, Kuldhara feels more haunted than ruins ravaged by time. The official explanation has been repeated so often it has acquired the weight of established fact. Salim Singh, the corrupt tax collector of the Yaisalm estate, became obsessed with the village chief's daughter and threatened to impose crushing taxes unless she married him. Rather than submit to this humiliation, the Palawal Brahmins chose collective exile, leaving their ancestral home forever. But this explanation, tidy as it sounds, fails to account for the supernatural elements that have accumulated around Kuldhara, like sediment around a stone. The curse is central to the mystery. According to local tradition, the Palawals didn't simply leave, they pronounced a malediction upon their village that would prevent anyone from ever successfully resettling there. This wasn't merely an expression of anger, but a deliberate spiritual act, a way of ensuring that what they couldn't possess, no one else could either. The curse was said to be so powerful that it would affect not just Kuldhara, but the 83 other villages that the Palawals abandoned simultaneously that same mysterious night. Archaeological evidence supports the sudden nature of the departure. Excavations have uncovered cooking pots with charred remains of meals that were never finished, personal belongings scattered as if their owners had simply stood up and walked away mid-task. Wells were deliberately filled with sand before the departure, not the work of raiders or enemies, but the careful actions of people who knew they would never return and wanted to ensure no one else could benefit from their labours. The precision of the abandonment suggests extensive planning, yet oral histories insist it happened in a single night. How does an entire population coordinate such a massive undertaking in absolute secrecy? How do 1,500 people, including elderly and children, simply disappear without leaving any trace of their destination? The logistics alone challenge belief, yet the evidence of their absence is irrefutable. Local shepherds and travellers began reporting strange phenomena within years of the abandonment. Voices echoing from empty houses, shadows moving in windows where no one lived, the sound of daily life. Children playing, women singing, men discussing business, emanating from the deserted streets. These weren't isolated incidents reported by superstitious individuals, but consistent accounts from multiple sources over decades. More disturbing were the attempts at resettlement. Despite the fertile land and intact infrastructure, every effort to reoccupy Kuldhara ended in failure. Families who moved into the abandoned houses reported overwhelming feelings of dread animals refused to stay, crops failed despite adequate water, and children became mysteriously ill. Some newcomers claimed to see the original inhabitants continuing their daily routines, translucent figures who went about their business as if the living settlers were the ghosts. Government officials documented these failed resettlement attempts throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. A British colonial report from 1890 noted that while Kuldhara remained structurally sound and agriculturally viable, the local population maintains an absolute conviction that the site is cursed, rendering any development efforts futile. This wasn't mere superstition, but observed reality. Economic incentives, government encouragement, and practical necessity all proved insufficient to overcome whatever force kept Kuldhara empty. The mystery deepened as researchers began investigating the other 83 villages that were supposedly abandoned the same night. While most showed signs of gradual decline over years or decades, several displayed the same characteristics as Kuldhara: sudden, complete abandonment with personal belongings left behind. The geographic distribution of these simultaneously abandoned settlements covered hundreds of square kilometres, making coordinated evacuation even more implausible. Modern paranormal investigators and archaeologists have documented electromagnetic anomalies throughout Kuldhara that have no apparent natural explanation. Digital recording equipment malfunctions in specific locations, compass readings deviate wildly, and sensitive individuals report overwhelming sensations of being watched. These phenomena cluster around the former residential areas, particularly the houses of village leaders, suggesting that whatever force maintains Kuldhara's emptiness is not randomly distributed, but follows the patterns of the original community. Temperature measurements reveal inexplicable cold spots in certain buildings, despite the desert heat. These areas remain consistently cooler than their surroundings, regardless of season or time of day, as if the stone itself retains some memory of human presence that manifests as physical phenomenon. Infrared photography has captured human-shaped heat signatures in empty rooms, always photographed from the same angles, always in the same locations, as if invisible residents continue to occupy their homes. The water systems present perhaps the most puzzling aspect of Kuldhara's preservation. Despite 2 centuries of abandonment, many of the underground channels remain clear and functional. In a region where sand covers everything within years, this maintenance suggests either impossibly sophisticated engineering or ongoing supernatural intervention. Local traditions claim that the water itself is cursed, that anyone who drinks from Kuldhara's wells will be compelled to return, unable to find peace elsewhere. Attempts to scientifically document the curse have produced inconclusive but suggestive results. Statistical analysis of resettlement attempts shows failure rates far exceeding normal probability, while psychological studies of visitors reveal consistent patterns of unease that correlate with specific locations within the village. Sleep studies conducted on-site record unusual brainwave patterns and frequent reports of vivid dreams featuring unfamiliar people conducting everyday activities in perfect detail. The tourism that now surrounds Kuldhara has created its own layers of mystery. Visitors consistently report cameras malfunctioning at crucial moments, tour groups becoming separated despite travelling together, and the feeling that they're being followed by invisible companions. These experiences are so common that local guides now warn tourists what to expect, yet the phenomena continue with mechanical regularity. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Kuldhara is how little it has changed. While other abandoned settlements succumb to time and weather, Kuldhara seems frozen at the moment of departure. Buildings deteriorate at rates that appear slower than natural, as if time itself moves differently here. Vegetation grows sparsely despite adequate soil and water, and the animals that venture into the ruins never stay long, suggesting that whatever drove out the human inhabitants affects other living creatures as well. The curse of Kuldhara operates not through dramatic supernatural events, but through a persistent wrongness that accumulates over time. It's not that something terrible happens to those who enter, but that nothing quite happens as it should. Food tastes wrong, sleep brings no rest, familiar objects feel foreign, and the simple act of existing becomes an exhausting struggle against invisible resistance. Standing in Kuldhara at dusk, when the desert heat finally begins to subside and the first stars appear in the vast Rajasthani sky, visitors often report the same sensation, the feeling that they are intruding on a community that remains active but exists just beyond perception. The empty doorways seem to watch, the silent streets echo with the memory of footsteps, and the very air carries the weight of lives interrupted but not ended. The Paliwal Brahmins achieved what they intended. They made Kuldhara uninhabitable for anyone else while preserving it as a monument to their choice. Whether through supernatural intervention or simply the power of collective belief reinforced over generations, they created a place that exists in permanent suspension between abandonment and occupation, where the past refuses to become history and the future never quite arrives. Kayakoy, Turkey, the town of two names. There is a particular quality to abandoned places in the Mediterranean, a way the light falls differently through empty windows, how the silence seems older and more deliberate than mere absence of sound. But Kayakoy possesses something more, the weight of deliberate forgetting, of a community that didn't simply fade away but was surgically removed from existence, leaving behind a skeleton of stone that refuses to decay and refuses to be inhabited. The locals call it Kayakoy now, the rock village, but the ghosts still answer to Levisi, the name that echoed through these narrow streets for over 2,000 years. Walk through the ruins today and you'll find something unprecedented, a town that died not from disease or disaster, but from a bureaucratic decision made in distant capitals, a place that became a casualty of nationalism and the cold mathematics of population exchange. In 1923, this hillside settlement overlooking the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean housed nearly 10,000 Greek Orthodox Christians whose families had lived here since before the Ottoman Empire, some tracing their roots back to Byzantine times. They tended olive groves that had been cultivated for centuries, operated shops that served travellers along ancient trade routes, and worshipped in churches where their ancestors had prayed in Greek for generations uncounted. Their neighbours were Turkish Muslims, and together they had created a community where languages mixed freely and festivals were shared across religious lines. Then came the morning when everything changed forever, not through war or conquest, but through a document signed in Lausanne, Switzerland, that decreed that Muslims and Christians could no longer live side by side. The convention concerning the exchange of Greek and Turkish populations mandated that Orthodox Christians in Turkey would be relocated to Greece, while Muslims in Greece would be sent to Turkey. It was ethnic engineering on a massive scale, presented as a solution to the minority problem that had emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. The residents of Levisi had perhaps a few weeks to gather what they could carry and abandon everything else. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in those final days, the desperate attempts to sell properties that no one could buy, the decisions about which family heirlooms to pack and which to leave behind, the promises to return that everyone knew were impossible to keep. Children born in these houses were told they would never see them again. Elderly residents prepared to die in exile from the only land they had ever known. The exchange was supposed to be orderly, civilized, even humane by the standards of the time. Families weren't driven out at gunpoint but were given official papers, transportation to ports, and assurance that they would be resettled with dignity in their true homeland. Yet this bureaucratic efficiency made the tragedy somehow worse. There was no one to blame, no enemy to hate, just the inexorable machinery of modern nationalism grinding individual lives into statistical units. What the departing Greeks left behind was a ghost town of extraordinary completeness. Unlike communities abandoned due to war or economic collapse, Levisi was frozen at the moment of evacuation. Houses stand with their original furniture, churches contain their icons and liturgical items, and shops retain their inventories. The Muslims who were supposed to replace the Greek population never came in sufficient numbers, and many who did arrive found the atmosphere so oppressive that they left for other settlements. The architecture itself tells the story of disruption. Greek houses built in a distinctive style with stone walls and red tile roofs stand empty next to the modest wooden homes of the few Turkish families who remained. Two different building traditions exist side by side, but the dominant Greek structures give the settlement its character and its haunted quality. The houses weren't designed for abandonment. They were built by people who expected their children and grandchildren to inherit them. But Kayakoy's mystery extends beyond its historical tragedy. There's something about the place that resists new habitation, something that goes beyond economics or practical considerations. Multiple attempts have been made to develop the site for tourism or to encourage resettlement, Yet these efforts consistently fail in ways that seem almost deliberate. Construction projects encounter unexpected obstacles, investors withdraw suddenly, and residents who do move in find themselves compelled to leave within months. The phenomenon is subtle but persistent. Families who attempt to live in the restored houses report dreams so vivid and unsettling that sleep becomes impossible. These aren't generic nightmares, but specific visions of the previous inhabitants going about their daily routines. Cooking in kitchens, tending gardens that no longer exist, conducting conversations in a language the dreamers don't understand but somehow comprehend. The dreams aren't threatening, which makes them more disturbing. They suggest that the original community continues to exist in some parallel layer of reality. Visitors consistently describe a sense of intrusion, as if they're walking through a home where the family has just stepped out temporarily. Personal belongings remain in some houses: photographs, books, children's toys, covered in decades of dust but somehow resistant to the decay that should have claimed them. Textiles that should have rotted away remain recognizable. Letters written in Greek script lie scattered on floors, and Orthodox crosses hang on walls where no one has prayed for nearly a century. The two churches that dominate Kayakoy's skyline present the most compelling evidence of supernatural preservation. The Cathedral of the Taxiarchs and the smaller chapel of Panaya remain structurally intact despite decades of neglect. Their frescoes, though faded, retain enough detail to be clearly recognizable, and their altars still bear the marks of their final services. Local Muslims avoid entering these buildings, not from disrespect but from a deep sense that they remain consecrated to another faith, still occupied by invisible congregations. Temperature anomalies cluster around the religious buildings and the larger houses that belong to prominent Greek families. Even on scorching summer days, certain rooms remain inexplicably cool, while in winter, some spaces retain warmth long after the sun has set. These microclimates seem to follow the patterns of the original community's daily life. Kitchens stay warm, bedrooms remain cool, and gathering spaces maintain comfortable temperatures regardless of weather. Sound phenomena add another dimension to the mystery. Residents of nearby villages report hearing church bells ringing from Kayakoy on Orthodox feast days. Despite the fact that the bells were removed decades ago, the sounds aren't imagined. Multiple witnesses from different locations describe the same timing and duration. Even more unsettling are reports of conversations, laughter, and children playing that seem to emanate from specific houses at particular times of day, as if the village's social rhythms continue on some inaudible frequency. Photography in Kayakoy produces consistently anomalous results. Digital cameras malfunction in predictable patterns, always in the same locations. Film develops with unexpected images, shadows where no shadow should exist, human figures that weren't visible when the pictures were taken, and inexplicable light sources that seem to emanate from within the abandoned buildings. Professional photographers have documented these phenomena repeatedly, yet no technical explanation accounts for their consistent occurrence. The village cemetery, located on a hillside overlooking the ruins, remains meticulously maintained despite having no official caretaker. Graves from the early 20th century appear freshly tended, with weeds mysteriously absent and headstones clean of the lichens that cover every other stone surface in the area. Orthodox crosses carved into the memorial stones show no signs of the weathering that affects similar monuments elsewhere in the region. Children who visit Kayakoy with their families often display knowledge they shouldn't possess, pointing to specific houses and describing the families who lived there, naming churches they've never entered, speaking about events from the 1920s as if they were recent occurrences. When questioned, these children can't explain their knowledge and often forget these details once they leave the village, as if the information belongs to the place rather than to them. Modern Turkey has officially recognized the tragedy of the population exchange and made efforts to preserve Kayakoy as a symbol of tolerance and coexistence. Yet these preservation efforts encounter ongoing difficulties that seem to exceed normal bureaucratic or financial obstacles. Plans stall inexplicably, funding disappears, and workers report equipment failures and accidents that force repeated delays. The Mediterranean sun sets each evening over Kayakoy, painting the empty stone houses in shades of gold and amber that make them appear momentarily inhabited. In this light, the village seems to shimmer between past and present, as if time itself has become unstable here. Shadows move through doorways where no one walks. Windows reflect images of rooms that should be empty, and the very air carries traces of lives that ended too abruptly to fully depart. Kayakoy endures as a monument to displacement, but also as evidence that some disruptions cut too deeply to heal cleanly. The population exchange solved a political problem by creating a spiritual wound that continues to bleed nearly a century later. The village stands as testament to the Greek community that built it, but also as a warning about the costs of reducing human complexity to simple categories of belonging. In the gathering dusk, when the last tourists have departed and the coastal winds carry the scent of wild herbs through empty streets, Kayakoy settles into its nocturnal existence. The silence isn't empty but full, pregnant with voices that speak in a language that is officially dead here but refuses to stop echoing through the stone houses that were never meant to outlive their builders. Kolmanskop, Namibia, where diamonds turn to sand. Sand has a hunger all its own. It moves with purpose, flowing like liquid, climbing walls like ivy, filling spaces with the patience of geological time compressed into human years. In the Namib Desert, where the oldest dunes on Earth shift with winds that have blown for millions of years, this hunger found a feast in Kolmanskop, a town built on the promise of diamonds, now being slowly consumed by the very desert that yielded its treasures. But let us begin not with sand, but with light, the particular quality of illumination that filters through broken windows, casting geometric patterns across floors where diamonds once scattered like fallen stars. Photographers come from around the world to capture these moments when the Namib sun transforms abandoned rooms into galleries of shadow and brilliance, when nature's reclamation project becomes an art installation of almost supernatural beauty. The woman who discovered it all was probably not thinking about beauty. Zacharias Lawler, working the railway line in 1908, was likely focused on more mundane concerns. The heat, the endless stretches of track, the backbreaking labour of maintaining transportation links across one of the world's most hostile environments. But something caught her eye in the sand beside the tracks, a stone that gleamed with unusual fire, that seemed to capture and concentrate the desert light in ways that ordinary pebbles never could. That stone was a diamond, and with its discovery, the most unlikely boomtown in African history began to rise from the dunes. Within months, fortune hunters arrived from Germany, South Africa, Britain, men who had never seen desert like this, who had no conception of how the Namib could simultaneously create and destroy human ambition. They brought with them not just mining equipment, but an entire European civilization. Operas, houses and bowling alleys, ballrooms and ice factories, hospitals equipped with the latest medical technology, and schools that taught German and English to children who played in gardens watered with precious imported soil. The irony was perfect. In one of the most water-scarce environments on Earth, Kolmanskop consumed luxury with breathtaking excess. Ice was shipped from Cape Town to cool champagne at parties where diamonds served as party favours. The hospital boasted the first X-ray machine in the Southern Hemisphere. The ballroom hosted elaborate dances where women wore gowns imported from Berlin and men discussed the international diamond market while servants refilled crystal glasses with wine that had travelled thousands of miles to reach this outpost of impossible prosperity. Yet from the very beginning, the sand was watching, waiting, infiltrating. Even during Kolmanskop's golden years, residents fought a constant battle against the desert's advance. Sand filled gutters overnight, accumulated in corners despite constant sweeping, and worked its way into the most carefully sealed buildings. The town employed teams whose sole job was sand removal, an occupation that must have felt like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The diamonds were everywhere, literally lying on the surface, scattered across the desert floor like a deity's dropped jewellery. For a brief, hallucinatory period, Kolmanskop was perhaps the wealthiest per capita settlement in the world. Miners would finish their shifts and walk home, across ground that glittered with gems worth more than most people's annual salaries. Children played games with diamonds, and housewives swept precious stones off their porches like leaves. But the desert had its own timeline, operating according to principles that bore no relationship to human economics or German efficiency. While the residents built their impossible town, the Namib was already in motion, sand grains travelling on winds that had been circling the earth since before humans discovered fire. Each grain was a messenger from the deep desert, carrying news that this intrusion would be temporary. The end came not with dramatic collapse, but with the same inexorable patience that characterises everything in the Namib. By the 1920s, the easily accessible diamonds were exhausted. Richer deposits discovered further south drew away the miners, the merchants, the dreamers who had built this impossible community. Families packed their possessions, loaded trucks and trains, and departed for new opportunities, leaving behind buildings that had cost fortunes to construct and furnish. What they could not take with them was the infrastructure of luxury that had defined Kolmanskop's character. The opera house remained, its stage still set for performances that would never come. The hospital's X-ray machine stayed in place, too expensive and cumbersome to relocate. Kitchens retained their imported copper pots, bedrooms their hand-carved furniture, parlours their Persian rugs and oil paintings that had once graced homes in Hamburg or Munich. The sand moved in immediately, not as an invader but as a native returning home. It flowed through open doors, settled into corners, accumulated in bathtubs where European families had once tried to wash away the desert dust. Year by year, room by room, Kolmanskop was buried by the environment that had briefly tolerated its existence. This is where Kolmanskop transcends mere abandonment and becomes something approaching art. The sand doesn't destroy the buildings, it preserves them in a state of perpetual transformation. Wallpaper, protected by the sand that covers it, retains colours that would have faded to nothing under the desert sun. Furniture emerges from dunes like archaeological artefacts, perfectly preserved by the same forces that buried them. Walking through Kolmanskop today is like touring a museum where the exhibits change constantly but never lose their power to astonish. In the hospital, sand has filled the operating theatre to waist height, but the surgical table still rises above the dunes like an island. The ballroom's elegant chandelier hangs over a floor transformed into rolling hills of sand that shift and reshape with every wind. The bowling alley has become a sandy ravine where the pins stand like sentinels in a transformed landscape. Each room tells a different story of the relationship between human ambition and natural force. In some, the sand has filled the space completely, creating smooth surfaces that reach almost to the ceiling. In others, the desert has arranged itself into perfect dunes that follow the contours of the original architecture, as if the building has taught the sand how to behave. Windows frame views of other windows, creating infinite recursions of abandonment that photographer and philosopher alike find irresistible. The most haunting spaces are those where the desert has achieved perfect equilibrium with human design. A bedroom where sand has filled the space between floor and mattress, creating a new ground level from which furniture emerges like modernist sculpture. A kitchen where dunes have covered everything but the highest shelves, preserving a perfect cross-section of domestic life from 90 years ago. A parlour where the sand has arranged itself in sweeping curves that complement the room's original geometry, as if the desert has learned to appreciate interior design. But Kolmanskop is not static. The sand continues to move, to shift, to reveal and conceal in endless cycles. What tourists photographed yesterday may be completely changed by tomorrow's wind. Rooms that were filled to the ceiling can be scoured clean by particularly strong storms, revealing spaces that haven't been seen for decades. The desert is constantly redecorating, constantly curating its own exhibition of human impermanence. Local guides speak of the town's moods, of how different weather conditions create different personalities in the ruins. During sandstorms, when visibility drops to mere meters, Kolmanskop becomes a maze where even experienced visitors can become disoriented. On clear mornings, when the light is soft and the shadows long, the town appears almost habitable, as if its residents might return from some extended vacation. At sunset, when the setting sun turns everything to gold, Kolmanskop achieves a beauty so transcendent that visitors frequently describe it as spiritual. The diamonds are still there, hidden in the sand that fills the buildings, scattered in the dunes that surround the town. Visitors occasionally find small stones that might be gems, though removing them is strictly forbidden. The irony persists. A town built on diamond wealth now guards its treasures within the very sand that destroyed it. Night in Kolmanskop brings a silence so complete it seems solid, broken only by the whisper of sand against glass and the distant calls of desert creatures adapted to this harsh environment. Stars appear in numbers impossible to see in light-polluted areas, and the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a cosmic river. In this darkness, it becomes easy to understand why the first European visitors found the Namib simultaneously terrifying and beautiful, a landscape that operates according to rules that have nothing to do with human comfort or comprehension. As dawn breaks over the Namib, painting the dunes in shades of rose and gold, Kolmanskop emerges from the night like a dream half remembered. The sand continues its patient work, grain by grain, wind by wind, season by season. What began as the triumph of human ambition over natural hostility has become something more complex and perhaps more beautiful, a collaboration between human architecture and natural force that creates spaces no architect could design and no museum could curate. The desert keeps Kolmanskop as both trophy and warning, a monument to the temporary nature of all human achievement and the eternal patience of natural process. Here, in rooms where champagne once flowed and diamonds glittered in crystal bowls, the sand writes its own history, a story of persistence and transformation that will continue long after the last photograph is taken and the last tourist departs. Humberstone and Santa Laura Saltpeter Works, Chile, the theatre at the end of the world, begin with the children, not the ones who play here now, tourist children who dart between rusted machinery and pose for photographs, but the ghosts of those who once called this place home. In the old theatre of Humberstone, their laughter still echoes from wooden seats that face a stage where no curtain has risen for decades. Close your eyes in that dusty auditorium, and you can almost hear them. The sound of small hands clapping, feet shuffling with excitement, voices calling out during Christmas pageants performed under the vast indifference of the Atacama sky. This is how Humberstone reveals itself, not as a place where industry died, but as a community that simply stopped mid-sentence, leaving behind the infrastructure of joy alongside the machinery of labour. The swimming pool, carved from concrete and lined with imported tiles, still holds its rectangular promise of relief from the desert heat. The ballroom floor, warped by decades of thermal expansion and contraction, remembers the weight of dancers who celebrated paydays and holidays with equal fervour. The school desks, arranged in neat rows, wait for students who will never return from a recess that began in the 1960s. But to understand why these intimate spaces feel so haunted, we must first comprehend the sheer audacity of building them here, in the most arid desert on Earth, where some weather stations have never recorded a single drop of rain. The Atacama doesn't merely lack water, it actively devours moisture, sucking humidity from the air, from human skin, from any organic matter foolish enough to venture into its domain. Yet here, in this landscape that makes Mars seem hospitable, thousands of families created not just mining operations, but entire civilizations complete with swimming pools, theatres, and ice cream parlours. The wealth that made this possible came from sodium nitrate, white gold extracted from the desert floor through processes that transformed the Atacama from wasteland into the economic engine of Chile. Saltpeter, essential for both fertilizer and explosives, turned these remote mining camps into boom towns that attracted workers from across South America and Europe. At their peak, Humberstone and Santa Laura weren't merely profitable, they were among the most technologically advanced communities in Chile, featuring electric lighting, refrigeration and communication systems that rivaled those of Santiago. James Thomas Humberstone, the British engineer whose name the largest camp would eventually bear, arrived in the 1870s with ideas that seemed designed to prove human dominance over impossible environments. His innovations in nitrate extraction transformed an industry, but more importantly, his vision of worker welfare created something unprecedented in industrial mining. Company towns that prioritize not just productivity but quality of life. He understood that men who brought their families to the desert required more than wages. They needed reasons to stay, reasons to call this alien landscape home. The result was a social experiment conducted under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Workers who spent their days extracting chemicals from the earth returned each evening to communities that offered tennis courts, libraries, and social clubs. Children born in these desert outposts attended schools that rivaled urban institutions, learning multiple languages while the nearest city lay hundreds of kilometers away, across landscapes that could kill the unprepared traveller within hours. The engineering required to sustain these communities was as audacious as their cultural ambitions. Every drop of water had to be imported or carefully recycled, every scrap of vegetation nurtured with obsessive care. The company stores stocked goods from around the world: French wines, German sausages, British woolens, all transported across thousands of kilometres of desert to satisfy the tastes of workers who had left their homelands for the promise of wealth in the world's most unforgiving environment. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these communities was how quickly they developed their own traditions, their own sense of place rooted not in the landscape, but in defiance of it. Humberstone's annual festivals became legendary throughout the region, drawing visitors from across Chile who came to witness the spectacle of European-style celebrations conducted under the endless blue dome of the Atacama sky. The theatre hosted touring companies from Lima and Buenos Aires, while the ballroom witnessed wedding receptions that lasted until dawn broke over the mineral-stained mountains. The swimming pool deserves particular attention as a symbol of everything these communities represented. In a desert where water was more precious than gold, the creation of a recreational swimming facility was an act of almost incomprehensible luxury. Yet there it was, Olympic-sized, filled with imported water, surrounded by changing rooms and social areas where families gathered for weekend parties. Children who had never seen an ocean learned to swim in chlorinated water that had travelled further than most people would journey in their entire lives. The decline, when it came, was as sudden as the rise had been gradual. The development of synthetic nitrates during World War I made the natural deposits economically unviable overnight. International markets that had driven decades of prosperity simply vanished, leaving communities that had been built to last generations with no economic purpose. The transition from boom to abandonment took less than 5 years, barely enough time for residents to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The evacuation process revealed the depth of community bonds that had developed in these artificial oases. Families who had lived in the desert for generations found themselves choosing between staying in a landscape they loved but could no longer afford, or abandoning homes where they had buried grandparents and celebrated the births of children. Many chose to stay until the infrastructure collapsed around them, maintaining their gardens and social rituals even as the company stores closed and the machinery fell silent. What they left behind was unprecedented in the archaeology of abandonment, complete communities preserved by the very conditions that had made their existence so improbable. The Atacama's extreme aridity, which had required constant battle during the town's active years, became their preservation mechanism. Wood that should have rotted remained structurally sound. Textiles that should have disintegrated retained their colours and patterns. Paper documents protected from moisture that never came preserved records of daily life with photographic clarity. The preservation extends to details that seem almost supernatural in their completeness. In the company store, product labels remain legible on shelves that still hold packages of goods from the 1950s. The pharmacy contains bottles of medicines with dosage instructions printed in multiple languages, testimony to the international character of these communities. The barbershop retains its chairs and mirrors, its floor still scattered with hair from the last customers who never returned for their next appointments. But it is in the recreational spaces that the preservation becomes most poignant. The theatre seats, though faded, still bear the impressions of bodies that occupied them for decades of entertainment. The ballroom floor shows where patterns that map the movements of countless dances, social gatherings where different nationalities mixed in ways impossible in their countries of origin. The swimming pool, though long empty, retains the diving board from which children launched themselves into imported water under the gaze of parents who had travelled thousands of kilometres to give their families better lives. Modern visitors often report a sense of temporal displacement walking through these spaces, as if the towns exist in a pocket of frozen time where the 1950s never ended. This sensation is enhanced by the preservation of personal items, family photographs still displayed in empty houses, children's toys scattered in yards where no children have played for decades, kitchen utensils arranged as if their owners had merely stepped out temporarily. The UNESCO designation that protects Humberstone and Santa Laura recognises them not merely as industrial heritage, but as testimony to human adaptability and the universal desire to create beauty even in the most challenging circumstances. These communities represent something unique in industrial history, places where labour and culture achieved a synthesis that transcended mere economic function. Standing in the empty theatre as afternoon light slants through broken windows, watching dust motes dance in beams that once illuminated performers from distant cities, one confronts the fundamental paradox of these places. They were built as permanent solutions to temporary economic opportunities, monuments to human ambition constructed in an environment that tolerates no permanent human presence. Yet in their abandonment they achieved a different kind of permanence, preservation as perfect and complete as the mummification that the desert provides to everything foolish enough to die within its boundaries. The Atacama keeps its treasures well, whether they are ancient mummies or abandoned swimming pools, whether they are pre-Columbian artifacts or theatre seats that remember the weight of children watching Christmas pageants under stars that shine with unusual clarity in air too dry to support clouds. Here, in the world's most arid desert, human dreams have been freeze-dried into monuments that will outlast most of the cities whose prosperity they once served. Lawlers, Western Australia, where gold outlives memory. The stories begin with a shimmer on the horizon. The endless outback, heat-warped and humming, can play tricks on the eyes and the mind. But the gold was real. For a brief and fevered moment, Lawlers drew men and women from across continents, promising riches that glinted just beneath the iron-red earth of the Australian desert. Today, all that remains of Lawlers are a scattering of sun-bleached foundations and the ghosts of ambition, dissolving into silence under a sky so vast it dwarfs every dream. Unlike other towns built for permanence, Lawlers was always a place in motion, a settlement created by the urge to move, dig and possess, to chase a future that always seemed one lucky strike away. The first gold was found here in 1892 at the height of Western Australia's greatest gold rush. The news spread in wild, rumour-laden waves, carried by camel trains and word of mouth, lighting up the parched bush with the promise of easy fortunes. There was no gradual birth for Lawlers. It appeared almost overnight as tents and rough timber shacks sprang up along dusty tracks. The town swelled with thousands of hopeful diggers, itinerant traders, drovers, blacksmiths and fortune-seekers from every corner of the British Empire and beyond. Lawlers became a crossroads for ambition, a temporary city whose only building materials were what could be hauled by wagon or hacked from the surrounding scrub. The gold, they said, was so plentiful that flakes glittered in the wash of every pan. For a year or two, Lawlers was a boom town in the truest sense. Pubs overflowing onto the street, prospectors lining up at the assay office, bakers and butchers selling their goods at prices that would shame city markets. The clamour of picks and the laughter of the recently lucky filled the air, all beneath the relentless Australian sun. But this was never a place for comfort. Lawlers sat on the edge of one of the world's harshest regions, the Western Australian desert, a landscape indifferent to human needs. Days routinely soared above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit, with barely a hint of shade anywhere. Water was more valuable than gold itself. It had to be carted in from distant wells, or later, pumped through ingenious, yet unreliable, pipelines that creaked and leaked across the dry plains. Dust coated everything: food, bedding, lungs. It worked its way into machinery, causing breakdowns at the worst moments, and into the very bones of those who stayed long enough to notice the toll. The water situation alone should have deterred permanent settlement. During summer months, temperatures in the shade, what little could be found, regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The surrounding landscape offered no natural water sources, forcing the entire community to depend on an elaborate system of condensers, tanks, and carefully rationed supplies. Men died of thirst within sight of the town when their water ran out during prospecting expeditions. The government eventually constructed a massive water condensing plant, a marvel of engineering that attempted to extract moisture from the desert air. But even this technological achievement could barely keep pace with demand. Yet, in those first years, hardship was a badge of honour, worn with jokes and camaraderie. Lawlers developed its own rough culture, a blend of bush ingenuity, swagger and stubbornness. The men and a surprising number of women who lasted a season or more told tales of survival that grew taller with each retelling. Weddings in hastily built churches, races run across flat stretches of red earth, and the constant speculation of who would next strike it rich. The town had its own newspaper, the Lawlers Miner, reporting in equal measure on gold yields, lost camels, and the occasional murder when tempers boiled over in the heat. The social fabric of Lawlers was unlike anywhere else in Australia. Chinese miners worked claims alongside Irish diggers. German engineers shared tables with Aboriginal guides who knew the country's secrets, and American prospectors swapped stories with South African veterans of the Kimberley fields. The common pursuit of gold created a temporary democracy, where a man's worth was measured not by his accent or origins, but by the colour of dust in his pan and his ability to endure another day under the merciless sun. By the turn of the century, Lawlers had matured into something resembling a permanent town. The main street boasted a post office, a police station, several hotels, a bakery, and stores carrying everything from pickaxes to patent medicines. There was even a cricket team, which played matches on a pitch painstakingly cleared of rocks and maintained, despite the complete absence of grass. The grandest building was the Lawlers Hotel, a 2-story edifice with verandas that tried in vain to keep out the heat, promising cool drinks and a respite from dust and flies. The hotel became the social centre of the community, its bar serving as unofficial stock exchange, where mining claims were bought and sold, partnerships formed and dissolved, and fortunes won and lost over hands of cards that stretched through the cooler hours of night. The upper rooms housed travelling merchants, government officials, and the occasional journalist who came to document life on the goldfields for readers in distant cities who could barely imagine such extremes of climate and circumstance. But as quickly as the town had risen, the cracks began to show. The goldfields, rich at first, grew patchy and stubborn. The shallow alluvial deposits were depleted, forcing miners to dig deeper, expend more effort, and invest in expensive machinery that could not always be kept in working order. The harshness of the desert, once an afterthought amid gold fever, now asserted itself with relentless force. Droughts came, each one more severe than the last. Wells dried up, gardens withered, and livestock dropped dead in the paddocks. The mining itself became a battle against the environment. Machinery imported at enormous cost broke down in the heat and dust. Replacement parts took months to arrive, during which expensive equipment sat idle while maintenance costs continued to mount. The red dust infiltrated every mechanism, abrading moving parts and clogging delicate instruments. Workers suffered from a peculiar form of pneumonia, caused by inhaling the fine particles of silica and iron oxide that permeated the air. Water, always scarce, became a matter of life and death. The government built a massive condensing plant to turn brackish water into something drinkable, but the process was slow and the results never matched demand. At its worst, water was rationed by armed guards, and people paid in gold dust for a single bucket. The psychological effect of constant thirst was as debilitating as the physical symptoms. Men became obsessed with water, hoarding it, dreaming of it, measuring their lives by the level in their water tanks. The climate shaped every facet of existence. Wood for construction and fuel had to be transported over great distances, adding cost to every endeavour. Food supplies were unreliable, and many survived on tinned meat and damper bread, their teeth slowly giving way to scurvy and malnutrition. Flies and mosquitoes multiplied in the heat, carrying diseases that thinned the population just as surely as the dwindling gold. The cemetery grew at an alarming rate, filled with men and women who had come seeking fortune but found only unmarked graves in foreign soil. Medical care was primitive at best. The town's single doctor, when there was one, dealt with heat stroke, dehydration, mining accidents, and the peculiar ailments that seemed to emerge from the desert itself. Supplies of medicine were sporadic, and many conditions that would have been treatable in the city became death sentences in the isolation of Lawlers. The nearest hospital was hundreds of kilometres away, accessible only by arduous journey across trackless desert that could kill the sick as surely as any disease. Social life, once so vibrant, faded as reality set in. The hotels and pubs, once packed every night, emptied out as miners moved on to more promising strikes or simply gave up. The cricket pitch returned to scrub. Businesses closed, leaving hollow shells behind them. The Lawlers Miner ceased publication, its final issues full of farewells and advertisements for auctions of abandoned equipment. Families began to leave first, women unwilling to raise children in such harsh conditions, children falling sick from the heat and poor diet, men finally admitting that the gold was not worth the cost in health and happiness. The school closed when enrolment dropped below viable levels. The post office reduced its hours, then closed entirely except for irregular deliveries. By the 1920s, Lawlers was well on its way to becoming a ghost town. A handful of diehards remained, clinging to dreams or simply with nowhere else to go. They watched as the desert reclaimed the town in slow, steady increments. Roofs collapsed under the weight of dust storms, walls buckled in the relentless heat, and the wind carried away anything not nailed down. The red dust settled into every crevice, gradually burying the evidence of human occupation beneath layers of iron-rich sediment. The few remaining residents developed an almost mystical relationship with their dying town. They spoke of hearing voices in the wind, of seeing lights in abandoned buildings, of finding gold nuggets in places that had been thoroughly worked. Some claimed that the desert itself had become conscious, that it was actively reclaiming what had always been its own. Curiously, the old Lawlers Hotel managed to outlast most of its neighbours. For decades it stood empty but upright, a landmark for passing prospectors and adventurers. Stories grew around it, of hidden gold stashed within its walls, of ghosts haunting its upper rooms, of strange lights seen on moonless nights. Some said the spirits of those who never left still wandered the ruins, searching for veins of gold that only the desert itself could ever truly possess. The building became a pilgrimage site for those obsessed with lost treasures and abandoned places. Urban explorers, treasure hunters, and amateur archaeologists made their way to Lawlers, each hoping to discover some remnant of the town's golden age. They found little beyond rust and decay, but many reported the same sensation, a feeling of being watched, of walking through a place where time had stopped but consciousness remained. Today, only the most determined explorers reach Lawlers, guided by little more than faded tracks and GPS coordinates. What they find is not the dramatic ruin of some towns, but a subtler erasure, a few weathered walls, the iron stumps of machinery, rusted cans half buried in ochre sand. Occasionally the wind uncovers a forgotten coin or a scrap of newspaper, and for a moment the place seems to exhale a memory. The desert, of course, remembers everything. Where once there were gardens, the spinifex grows back and lizards bask on the stones of old chimneys. The relentless heat and the endless sky make it clear who the true winner was in the contest between gold and climate. Native plants have reclaimed the streets, their deep roots finding water sources that human engineering never could access. Yet Lawlers is not simply a warning against chasing riches. It is also a monument to the resilience and madness of hope, to the people who believed that for a brief while the desert could be mastered. The gold beneath the earth may still be there, unreachable or unprofitable, sparkling in the dark while the sun blazes overhead. Modern prospectors still work the area, using satellite imagery and sophisticated equipment to search for deposits that the old-timers missed. But none have recreated the brief miracle of community that once flourished here. In the end, it is the silence that settles most heavily, a silence broken only by the wind, the call of distant birds, and the faint, persistent shimmer of heat rising from red earth that holds its secrets close. The gold that drew thousands to this impossible place remains, patient and eternal, waiting for the next generation of dreamers foolish enough to believe they can wrestle treasure from a landscape that has outlasted every human ambition. Thames Town, China, the echo in the simulation. Step off the bus in the Shanghai suburbs, and the world shifts. The relentless, bustling energy of the Chinese metropolis falls away, replaced by an uncanny quiet. Before you rises a church steeple straight out of a Constable painting. Cobbled streets wind between Tudor-style buildings and Georgian terraces. Red phone boxes stand sentinel on corners, and a statue of Winston Churchill presides over a town square that feels both perfectly familiar and utterly alien. Welcome to Thames Town, a place built not over centuries, but from a blueprint, a place that feels less like a ghost town and more like a dream that forgot to wake up. This is not abandonment born of decay or disaster. No fire swept through here, no mine closed, no geological shift drove residents away. Thames Town was constructed with meticulous care in the early 2000s as part of a grand urban planning scheme by the Shanghai government to create themed satellite towns, easing population density in the city centre by offering aspirational, distinct living environments. The vision was to replicate the charm of classic English architecture and urban design, creating a desirable residential area that would attract Shanghai's burgeoning middle class, seeking refuge from the urban intensity. The architects and builders went to extraordinary lengths to replicate the English aesthetic. Pubs were designed with dark wood and brass fittings. Terraced houses featured bay windows and decorative brickwork. Even the street furniture, the benches, the lampposts, the litter bins, was modelled on its British counterparts. They imported iconic elements, a replica of a market cross, statues of famous British figures like Churchill and Shakespeare, even a full-sized, albeit non-functioning red telephone box on almost every corner. The effect is startlingly authentic, a perfectly curated slice of England dropped into the humid Chinese landscape. The construction process itself was a marvel of cultural translation. Chinese craftsmen studied British architectural traditions, learning to replicate details that had evolved over centuries in a different climate, for different people with different social patterns. They mastered the art of Tudor half-timbering, Georgian proportions, and Victorian ornamentation. Master stonemasons carved gargoyles and decorative cornices with precision that would have impressed medieval guilds. The result was technically perfect, perhaps more perfect than many actual English towns, which bear the accumulated scars and modifications of centuries of use. Yet, step inside one of the many ground-floor commercial spaces, the intended bakeries, boutiques and pubs, and you find not thriving businesses, but empty shells. Dust motes dance in the sunlight filtering through untouched windows. The air is still, silent, holding its breath. The meticulous detail of the facades hides interiors that have never known the warmth of a bustling shop or the clatter of a busy kitchen. This is the central mystery of Thames Town, a place designed for life, built for community, yet largely devoid of both. The residential buildings above the empty shops and along the quiet streets were sold, often at premium prices, but many were purchased as investments or second homes, not primary residences. The promised influx of daily life never materialized on the scale intended. The location, while ostensibly a suburb of Shanghai, felt too disconnected from the city's core for daily commuting for most. The cost of living, while perhaps justified by the unique environment, was high. And perhaps most fundamentally, a replica, no matter how perfect, lacks the soul that develops organically from generations of lived experience. The cultural disconnect runs deeper than mere aesthetics. English town planning evolved over centuries to accommodate specific social patterns. The pub as community centre, the high street as social artery, the parish church as focal point of civic life. These patterns don't translate directly to Chinese social structures. The pub, so central to British community life, has no equivalent in traditional Chinese culture. The church, magnificent in its Gothic revival splendour, serves no practical purpose in a largely secular society. The town square, designed for markets and gatherings, sits empty, because the social traditions that would have filled it never existed here. Thames Town exists in a strange state of perpetual anticipation, a stage set waiting for actors who never fully arrived. It is pristine in a way that real towns never are, its cleanliness and order unsettling in their completeness. There is no grime accumulating in corners, no peeling paint revealing layers of history, none of the comfortable messiness that signifies a place truly lived in. It is a town preserved not by abandonment after decay, but by an emptiness that has been present from its inception. The maintenance of this perfection requires constant effort. Teams of workers clean the streets daily, tend the carefully manicured gardens, and ensure that every detail remains as pristine as the day it was completed. This maintenance creates its own form of life, the invisible army of caretakers who preserve the simulation. They arrive early each morning, work quietly and efficiently, then vanish before the photographers arrive, leaving no trace of their presence except the perpetual newness they maintain. But to say Thames Town is completely uninhabited would be inaccurate, and would miss the unique form of life it does possess. While the residential population is sparse, and the commercial spaces remain largely empty, the town has found a peculiar purpose. It has become one of Shanghai's most popular backdrops for wedding photography. On any given weekend, the quiet streets come alive with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of couples posing in elaborate wedding attire. Brides in flowing white gowns stand beside grooms in sharp suits, their photographers directing them into picturesque scenes. They pose by the red phone boxes, stroll hand in hand across the cobbled bridge over the small artificial lake, lean against the perfectly replicated pub facades. For a few hours, the town is filled with laughter, music, and the energy of simulated celebration. Then, as the sun begins to set, the photographers pack up, the couples depart, and the silence returns, settling back over the empty streets like a shroud. The wedding photography phenomenon reveals something profound about contemporary Chinese culture and its relationship with Western imagery. For many couples, the English aesthetic represents sophistication, romance, and modernity. Their wedding photos, taken against Thames Town's backdrop, will hang in their homes as testament not just to their love, but to their aspirations and cultural sophistication. The town becomes a stage for performing a certain version of themselves, one connected to global rather than purely local traditions. This performative life adds another layer to the mystery. The town exists primarily as a stage for capturing idealized moments, moments that often have little connection to the reality of the place itself. People come here not to live, but to pretend to live, or at least to document a significant life event against a backdrop of imported charm. The architecture, designed to house daily routines, instead frames carefully constructed photographs. The streets built for pedestrian flow serve as runways for temporary photo shoots. Professional wedding photographers have developed specialized techniques for shooting in Thames Town, learning which angles best capture the English atmosphere, which times of day provide the most flattering light, how to position couples to suggest narrative and emotion against the theatrical backdrop. They've created an informal economy around the town's emptiness, transforming its lack of authentic life into a profitable simulation of romance. There are a handful of actual residents in Thames Town, mostly older couples or those working in the limited services that do exist. A small convenience store, a security office, maintenance facilities. What must it be like to live here? To wake up to the silence, walk through streets designed for thousands but populated by dozens, and witness the weekend invasion of wedding parties? Their daily lives unfold in the gaps between the performances, a quiet reality existing alongside the stage spectacle. These residents have developed their own relationship with their unusual environment. Some embrace their role as custodians of the simulation, taking pride in maintaining their portion of the fantasy. Others seem almost invisible, moving through the streets like ghosts themselves, neither fully part of the performance nor entirely separate from it. They shop in the convenience store that stocks both Chinese necessities and British imports, creating a surreal fusion of practical needs and aesthetic maintenance. Security guards patrol the town, their presence necessary to manage the influx of photographers and to ensure the pristine artificiality is maintained. They are the true custodians of Thames Town, the silent witnesses to its strange existence, their footsteps echoing in the quiet streets long after the wedding parties have gone. They've watched the town's evolution from hopeful beginning to its current state of permanent liminality, and their stories, if anyone bothered to collect them, would provide the most authentic narrative of this inauthentic place. The guards have developed an intimate knowledge of the town's rhythms. They know which corners are most popular with photographers, which buildings show the first signs of wear that require immediate attention, which residents need assistance, and which visitors might pose problems. They've become inadvertent documentarians of the town's strange life, witnessing thousands of wedding shoots, countless disappointed visitors, and the occasional filmmaker or journalist trying to capture the mystery of this place. Walking through Thames Town is an unsettling experience, a journey into what urban theorists call the uncanny valley of urbanism. It looks like a town, it feels like a town, but it lacks the intangible spark of a place that has grown organically, that carries the weight of history in its stones and the hum of countless lives in its air. The perfect replication highlights the absence. The meticulous detail only emphasizes what is missing. The mystery of Thames Town is not what caused its decline, but what it means to build emptiness on such a scale. What does it say about our desires when we replicate the past rather than build a new present? What is the value of authenticity in a world where simulations can be so perfectly rendered? Is a place still a place if it exists primarily as an image, a backdrop, a performance? Some visitors report a peculiar psychological effect while walking through Thames Town, a sense of déjà vu combined with profound displacement. The brain recognizes the visual cues of an English market town, but receives contradictory sensory information. The wrong sounds, the wrong smells, the wrong quality of light. This cognitive dissonance creates a unique form of urban uncanniness, a sensation that reality itself has become unstable. Thamestown stands as a peculiar monument to modern urban planning, global architectural trends, and the complex relationship between aspiration and reality. It is a ghost town of a different kind, haunted not by the past but by the future that never arrived, by the potential for life that remains locked behind empty facades. It represents a new category of abandonment, places that are empty not because they were once full and then emptied, but because they were designed for a fullness that never materialized. As dust settles, the street lamps flicker on, casting a warm, inviting glow on the empty streets. The replica pubs look particularly convincing in the soft light, promising warmth and camaraderie that isn't there. The silence deepens, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the real city and the occasional footsteps of a security guard on patrol. Thamestown waits, pristine and silent, a perfectly rendered echo in the simulation, a mystery of presence and absence that lingers long after you've left its quiet streets, raising questions about authenticity, aspiration, and the strange alchemy that transforms architecture into place. Rhyolite, Nevada, USA. The architecture of optimism. What remains when a dream dies young. In the Nevada desert, where the sun burns away pretense and the wind scours everything down to essential truth, the answer stands in crumbling concrete and rusted steel. Rhyolite is not merely a ghost town. It is a museum of ambition frozen at the moment of collapse, a place where the grandest aspirations of the American West crystallized into stone and then watched their purpose evaporate like morning dew in the Mojave heat. Consider the scale of what was attempted here. In 1904, when prospectors Shorty Harris and Ed Cross discovered gold in the Bullfrog Hills, they triggered the construction of what was intended to be Nevada's greatest city. Not a mining camp, not a rough settlement, but a metropolis. The plans called for grand hotels, opera houses, electric streetcars, and tree-lined boulevards that would rival anything in San Francisco or Denver. For 5 explosive years, Rhyolite grew faster than any city in American history, swelling from empty desert to a population of 10,000 in less time than it takes to graduate from high school. The ruins that remain tell this story in fragments of extraordinary ambition. The 3-story remains of the John S. Cook and Company Bank building still dominate the landscape, its reinforced concrete walls designed to last centuries. The bank was no frontier shack, but a monument to permanence, featuring marble counters, brass fixtures, and a vault that could have secured the treasures of kings. The builders used the most advanced construction techniques of the era, importing steel from Pittsburgh and craftsmen from California to create something that would announce Rhyolite's arrival as a serious city. Walk through the skeletal remains of the Bottle House today, and you confront one of the most peculiar monuments to recycling in American history. Tom Kelly, a saloon keeper, collected over 50,000 beer and liquor bottles, the detritus of a town that consumed alcohol as enthusiastically as it pursued gold, and built his entire house from them. The structure stands as both practical innovation and inadvertent art installation, its glass walls filtering desert light into patterns that change throughout the day. The bottles, embedded in adobe mortar, created a dwelling that was simultaneously whimsical and functional, providing insulation against the desert's extreme temperatures while making a statement about the creative possibilities born from abundance. The railroad depot, now a hollow shell of its former grandeur, represents perhaps the most revealing artifact of Rhyolite's brief flowering. The Las Vegas and Tonopah Railroad built a station here that was designed to handle thousands of passengers daily, with waiting rooms that featured polished wood paneling and brass appointments worthy of a major metropolitan terminal. The depot wasn't just a transportation hub, it was a declaration that Rhyolite had arrived, that it was connected to the wider world in ways that would ensure its permanent prosperity. But it is the school building that most powerfully illustrates the tragedy of interrupted optimism. Built to accommodate 500 students, the 2-story structure featured state-of-the-art heating, indoor plumbing, and classroom spaces designed according to the latest educational theories. The builders anticipated generations of children who would grow up as Rhyolite natives, who would consider this desert metropolis their natural home. The school represented faith in a future that extended far beyond the gold veins that had sparked the town's creation. The mining infrastructure reveals the industrial scale of the operation that supported this urban experiment. The ruins of mills and processing plants scatter across the surrounding hills, their machinery long since salvaged or rusted beyond recognition. But the foundations remain, massive concrete pads that once supported equipment capable of processing tons of ore daily. These industrial monuments were built not for short-term extraction but for decades of production, investments that assumed the gold would flow as reliably as a river. What makes Rhyolite's abandonment so striking is how suddenly the end came. The gold deposits, initially rich and easily accessible, proved disappointingly shallow. By 1908, the ore quality was declining precipitously. The financial panic of 1907 dried up the investment capital that had fueled the town's explosive growth. When the railroad stopped regular service in 1909, Rhyolite's fate was sealed. The exodus was as rapid as the arrival had been. Entire families loading their possessions onto wagons and disappearing into the desert, leaving behind houses they had expected to pass to their grandchildren. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Unlike towns that declined gradually over decades, Rhyolite simply stopped. The bank closed its vault for the final time. The school bell rang for the last recess. The depot's telegraph fell silent. The buildings that had been constructed to house a permanent population were suddenly, inexplicably empty, their windows staring out at a landscape that had returned to its natural state of magnificent desolation. Yet the ruins possess a strange beauty that transcends their historical significance. The desert has transformed them into something approaching sculpture. The concrete walls, bleached white by decades of solar radiation, create geometric patterns against the natural curves of the surrounding mountains. The bottle house, with its thousands of green and brown glass cylinders catching and refracting light, becomes a prism that breaks the harsh desert illumination into softer, more complex patterns. The photogenic quality of these ruins has made Rhyolite a pilgrimage site for artists and photographers who come seeking images that capture the relationship between human ambition and natural indifference. The structures frame the landscape in ways their builders never intended, creating compositions that highlight both the grandeur of the desert and the poignancy of abandoned dreams. At sunrise and sunset, when the light is soft and golden, the ruins seem to glow with their own internal fire, as if the optimism that built them still smoulders within the concrete and steel. Modern visitors often report a sense of temporal displacement walking among these ruins. The buildings are simultaneously ancient and modern, relics of the early 20th century that seem to belong to a much more distant past. This is partly due to the extreme preservation provided by the desert environment. Wood, metal, and concrete age differently in the absence of moisture, creating patinas and textures that would take centuries to develop in more temperate climates. The preservation extends to smaller artifacts scattered throughout the site. Pieces of mining equipment, fragments of household items, and architectural details create an open-air museum where visitors can examine the material culture of boom and bust capitalism. Unlike many historical sites where artifacts have been collected and catalogued, Rhyolite's remoteness has left many objects in situ, creating the impression that the residents simply walked away yesterday and might return at any moment. The psychological impact of Rhyolite extends beyond its historical importance or aesthetic appeal. The ruins serve as a meditation on the nature of permanence in American culture. Here was a community that invested enormous resources in creating infrastructure designed to last forever, yet the economic foundation that supported these investments proved as ephemeral as a desert flower that blooms for a single season after rain. The contrast between the grandeur of ambition and the completeness of failure creates a uniquely American form of melancholy. These were not ancient civilizations that declined over centuries, but contemporary people whose dreams of permanence were shattered within a single decade. The ruins speak to the peculiar optimism of the American West, where men and women repeatedly convinced themselves that this time, this place, this opportunity would be different from all the others that had failed. Wildlife has made its own peace with Rhyolite's remains. Lizards bask on sun-warmed concrete, birds nest in the spaces between walls, and desert plants grow through cracks in foundations, creating unlikely gardens in the most sterile environment imaginable. The ruins have become part of the ecosystem, providing shelter and vantage points for creatures that have no knowledge of the human drama that played out here. As evening falls over Rhyolite, the ruins settle into silhouettes against a sky that burns with colours that seem too vivid to be real. The mountains that surround the town site turn purple and gold, and for a moment it becomes possible to imagine the place as its builders envisioned it. Not a failure, but a magnificent achievement, a city that rose from nothing to claim its place among the great urban centres of the West. In that light, the ruins become not monuments to folly, but testimonies to the irrepressible human tendency to believe that this time, against all odds and evidence, the dream will endure forever. The wind picks up as darkness falls, whistling through the empty windows and doorways, carrying with it the sound of voices that spoke once of profits and progress, of children and grandchildren, of a future that stretched as far as the desert horizon. Rhyolite endures, not as its builders intended, but as something more complex and perhaps more beautiful, a place where American optimism was distilled to its purest form and then left to weather in the timeless laboratory of the Nevada desert. Pyramiden, Svalbard, Norway, the silence at the top of the world, begin not with the people, but with the cold. Before humans dreamed of empire or industry or home, the Arctic was here, a dominion of ice, wind and darkness, where the sun vanishes for months and the world becomes a vast blue-lit silence. Into this silence the Soviets carried an idea, a city at the edge of the possible, a model of human triumph beneath the shadow of a mountain shaped like a pyramid. Pyramiden. The word itself is an echo, borrowed from Norwegian for the pyramid, and as the coal-rich mountain rises behind the settlement in a perfect angular peak, it is easy to see how the place got its name. But the real monument is not the mountain. It is the town, built brick by brick, shipped across continents and oceans, constructed from Soviet steel, Siberian pine, and the unyielding optimism of planners certain that no latitude was too high for socialism. You arrive by boat or snowmobile, depending on the season. The sea here is an ever-changing threshold, sometimes a blue mirror, sometimes a frozen plain, sometimes a chaos of ice floes creaking and shifting with the tides. The journey itself is a ritual of passage, a confrontation with the limits of human endurance and machinery. Every kilometre north is a kilometre further from everything familiar. When you finally step ashore, Pyramiden appears out of the permafrost like a mirage. Perfectly straight roads, neat rows of prefabricated apartment blocks, the red brick cultural palace, the world's northernmost statue of Lenin gazing out across Adventfjorden with an unwavering stare. Unlike most ghost towns, Pyramiden did not grow organically, nor did it contract slowly. It was planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign. In 1927, the Swedish company that discovered coal here sold their claim to the Soviet Union. The Soviets, ever eager to prove that their system could transplant civilization to any corner of the globe, set about building a model town. Not merely a workplace, but a showcase, a proof of concept that the Arctic could be tamed and made to serve the needs of the state. For decades, Pyramiden thrived as a self-contained Soviet microcosm, an outpost of red banners, collective labour and communal life. At its peak, over 1,000 people, miners, engineers, teachers, doctors, cooks and children, called this place home. The town boasted amenities that would have been the envy of many cities: a grand cultural centre with a theatre and library, a music rehearsal room, a sports complex with an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a greenhouse for fresh vegetables, a hospital, and even a small dairy where cows supplied fresh milk and cream, their breaths steaming in the cold like smoke from old locomotives. The rhythm of life in Pyramiden was dictated by the coal mine. Miners descended into the earth in shifts, their days and nights governed less by the sun than by the clock and the flow of black rock that was sent south to power factories in the Soviet Union. Above ground, life followed the patterns of collective existence. Apartments were clean, functional and identical. Meals were taken in the communal cafeteria, where the day's menu was dictated by what had arrived on the last supply ship. Children went to school in a building painted cheerful colours, learning both Russian and Norwegian, along with stories about the polar bear, the reindeer, and the triumphs of Soviet science. There were stories too about the cold. Here the Arctic could not be ignored. The temperature might drop to -20 or -30 degrees Celsius, and the wind could make it feel colder still. On clear winter nights, the aurora would twist in silent ribbons over the town, painting the snow in green and purple light. Residents learned to live with the darkness and the cold, inventing rituals to mark time when the sun vanished in November and did not return until February. Birthdays and holidays were celebrated with vodka, music and laughter that rang out against the frozen silence. But Pyramiden was always more than a mining town. It was a living museum, a stage set for the performance of Soviet ideals. The town square was crowned by an enormous bust of Lenin, its base inscribed with the distance to Moscow. The cultural centre hosted performances of Russian ballet, films, and lectures on Marxist theory. The greenhouse was a symbol of the victory of planned labour over nature: cucumbers, tomatoes, and flowers blooming under lights while the world outside was locked in ice. The swimming pool was another small miracle, its turquoise water a tangible rebuke to the dark Arctic winter. Tourists who visit Pyramiden today often remark on the artefacts left behind. It is not the decay of centuries, but the abandonment of a single generation. Books remain on the shelves of the library, their spines faded but their pages untouched by mildew or rot. Pianos in the music room are still in tune, their keys waiting for hands that will never return. Shoes and coats hang neatly in the cloakroom. In the school, children's drawings, rockets, happy workers, polar bears still adorn the walls, though the artists have long since scattered across Russia and Ukraine and other places that are only names on a map here at the top of the world. The silence is profound. Unlike other abandoned places, Pyramiden was left almost overnight. In March 1998, the mine was officially closed. Within weeks, the population dwindled to a skeleton crew charged with maintaining the buildings. By October, the last regular residents boarded the supply ship and sailed south, leaving the keys with the Arctic foxes and the wind. The departure was orderly, as if life might someday resume. Yet the return never came, and the town entered a kind of temporal suspension. In Pyramiden, time is preserved by the cold. The permafrost locks everything in place. Decay is slow, subtle, more a matter of shifting shadows than visible ruin. The buildings stand as they were, the windows mostly unbroken, the signs in Russian and Norwegian still bright above the doors. The swimming pool is empty, its blue tiles gathering dust. The gymnasium's wooden floor is scuffed by the last basketball games played beneath banners of Soviet slogans. The only new graffiti are the paw prints of polar bears, who sometimes wander into the town in search of curiosity or a meal. Visitors, few and hardy, describe the sensation of walking through Pyramiden as stepping into a parallel universe. The objects of ordinary life are all here, but the people are not. There is no sense of disaster, no evidence of crisis, just the absence of voices, the echo of footsteps in endless corridors, the feeling that everyone simply stepped outside for a moment and might return at any time. The silence is not hostile, but it is absolute. Your breath seems loud, your heartbeat impossible to ignore. The guides who now inhabit Pyramiden in the brief Arctic summer are themselves figures out of time. They live in the old hotel, the Tulip, painted pink and yellow as if to defy the monochrome world outside. They tend to the buildings, lead small groups of tourists through the school, the music room, the canteen and the gym. They tell stories in Russian and English, about the Soviet scientists who monitored radio signals from the mountaintop, about the athletes who trained year-round in the Arctic, about the parties where the heat of the room and the vodka could make you forget, for an hour, the world outside. Sometimes, the guides say, visitors hear piano music drifting from the cultural centre, or distant laughter echoing down the main street. Sometimes, they see lights flicker in apartment windows where no one lives. These are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. They are the after-images of habit, the lingering traces of life lived intensely in a place where life is always precarious. Pyramiden is not simply a relic of the Soviet past, it is a meditation on the limits of human ambition and the persistence of hope. The town stands as a monument to the idea that, for a time, people believed they could build paradise anywhere, even at the world's end. The Arctic, indifferent and eternal, has reclaimed its silence. But the traces of that dream endure. The greenhouse, now filled with snow instead of tomatoes, the music room, where Bach and Tchaikovsky once kept the darkness at bay, the statue of Lenin, still watching over a town that was meant to last forever. There are plans, occasionally, to revive Pyramiden. The hotel is reopened, the power and hot water restored to a few buildings. Tourists come for the midnight sun, the northern lights, and the chance to walk through a living diorama of history. But the essential character of the place remains untouched, a city suspended in the Arctic, haunted by the memory of a vanished world. As you leave Pyramiden, the silence follows you down to the sea. The mountain still stands, its peak sharp against the endless sky. The town recedes into the ice and stone, waiting. The Arctic wind erases your footprints almost as soon as you make them. For a moment, you wonder if the people who built this place are still here, existing just out of sight, tending their gardens, playing music, believing still that the future can be conjured from the cold, if only you work hard enough, dream big enough, and never ever surrender to the silence. KCMC Staff Village, Tanzania, the houses that remember. The fever dreams begin with the sound of children playing, not the sharp laughter of tourist families visiting nearby Moshi, but something softer, more distant, voices that seem to drift through the walls of empty houses like smoke from cooking fires that went cold decades ago. Visitors to the abandoned KCMC Staff Village report these sounds most often in the late afternoon, when the shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro stretches across the compound and the air grows thick with the approaching equatorial dusk. Dr. Elizabeth Mwanga was among the first to hear them. In 1987, she'd been assigned housing in Block C, one of the newer residential units built to accommodate the growing medical staff of Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. The hospital itself was thriving, a beacon of modern healthcare in northern Tanzania, drawing patients from across East Africa and medical professionals from around the world. The staff village, constructed in phases throughout the 1970s and 1980s, was meant to provide comfortable, secure housing for doctors, nurses and administrators who had committed their lives to serving in this remote corner of the continent. The houses themselves were built to European standards, concrete block construction with tin roofs, screened windows to keep out mosquitoes, and small gardens where residents could grow familiar vegetables alongside local varieties. Each unit was equipped with running water, electricity and modern plumbing, luxuries that made the compound an island of first-world amenities in a region where such conveniences were rare. The architecture was functional rather than beautiful, designed by practical minds focused on creating safe, healthy environments for people who had already made significant sacrifices to work in rural Africa. Dr. Mwanga's house was typical of the compound: 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen with modern appliances shipped from Germany, and a small veranda where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset paint Kilimanjaro's peak in shades of gold and crimson. The furniture was standard-issue hospital housing, sturdy, comfortable, impersonal. It was a place designed for temporary residents, for people whose real homes were elsewhere, whose commitment to this place was measured in years rather than lifetimes. The children's voices she heard that first evening seemed to come from the house next door, where Dr. Peterson, a Swedish paediatrician, lived with his wife and 2 young sons. She assumed it was their children playing in the garden, though she couldn't understand why their voices sounded so muffled, as if they were speaking through water or calling from a great distance. When she mentioned it to Dr. Peterson the next day, he looked puzzled. His boys had been at boarding school in Nairobi for the past month. This was the beginning of what residents would later call the sounds, auditory phenomena that seemed to emanate from the houses themselves rather than from any identifiable source. Footsteps in upstairs bedrooms when houses were empty, conversations in Swahili drifting from kitchens where no one cooked, the soft crying of infants in units where no children lived. Most unsettling were the medical sounds, the beeping of monitors, the wheeze of respirators, the urgent voices of doctors calling for assistance, that seemed to echo from houses where no medical equipment had ever been installed. The KCMC administration initially dismissed these reports as stress-related hallucinations. Working in a developing country hospital was notoriously difficult, with long hours, limited resources, and the constant confrontation with diseases and conditions that were easily treatable in more developed nations. The emotional toll of watching children die from preventable illnesses, of performing surgery without adequate equipment, of losing patients who would have lived if they had been born elsewhere, this psychological burden could easily manifest as auditory hallucinations. But the phenomena weren't limited to individual experiences. Multiple residents reported identical sounds from the same houses at the same times. Recording equipment brought in by skeptical administrators captured voices, footsteps, and other unexplained audio phenomena. Electromagnetic field detectors registered anomalies that had no apparent source. Most convincingly, visitors who knew nothing about the compound's reputation independently reported hearing the same sounds that had been documented by residents for years. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a psychiatrist brought in to study the phenomenon, spent 3 months living in the compound and interviewing residents. Her report, filed with the hospital administration in 1991, documented over 200 separate incidents of unexplained auditory phenomena. More intriguingly, she discovered patterns in the reports. The sounds were most commonly heard in houses that had been occupied by medical staff who had died while serving at KCMC, Dr. Andrews, who suffered a heart attack during surgery, Nurse Kamau, who died in a car accident on the road to Arusha, Dr. Liu, who succumbed to malaria despite having access to the best preventive medicine available. The connection between death and the haunting suggested something more complex than simple psychological stress. Dr. Hoffman's interviews revealed that many of the medical staff who had died while serving at KCMC had formed profound emotional attachments to their work and to the compound. They had extended their contracts repeatedly, learned Swahili and local dialects, adopted African children, and spoken of Tanzania as their true home. For these individuals, death might not have represented departure, but rather a deeper form of residence. The most documented case involved Dr. James Morton, a British surgeon who had worked at KCMC for 15 years before dying of complications from malaria in 1989. His house in Block A had been his home longer than any place he had lived as an adult. He had married a Tanzanian nurse, raised 3 children in the compound, and frequently spoke of being buried in the hospital cemetery rather than being repatriated to England. After his death, his house became uninhabitable. Residents reported the constant sound of surgical instruments clattering, the whoosh of ventilators, and Dr. Morton's voice calling for particular medications in his distinctive Yorkshire accent. The hospital administration faced a practical crisis. The compound's reputation made it difficult to recruit and retain staff. New arrivals, informed about the haunting by existing residents, became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every unexplained phenomenon. Some refused to live in the compound altogether, preferring to rent accommodation in Moshi and commute to the hospital. Others requested transfers after only a few weeks of residence. In 1993, the decision was made to relocate staff housing to a new compound several kilometres away. The old village would be maintained as emergency accommodation and storage, but regular residential use would be discontinued. The transition took 2 years, during which the sounds seemed to intensify rather than diminish. Houses that had been quiet for months suddenly erupted with activity as residents prepared to leave. Some staff reported that the phenomena seemed almost pleading, as if the houses themselves were asking not to be abandoned. The exodus was completed in 1995, and the KCMC staff village was officially closed to residential use. A skeleton crew of maintenance workers continued to visit regularly, checking for structural problems and preventing vandalism, but no one lived there permanently. The sounds continued, now heard only by the occasional worker or the rare visitor who had permission to enter the compound. Over the following decades, the village acquired a reputation that extended far beyond the medical community. Local Tanzanians, who had always been somewhat wary of the compound's foreign architecture and Western lifestyle, began to speak of it as a place where the spirits of dead Mzungu, white people, had become trapped between worlds. Traditional healers were consulted, and several conducted cleansing ceremonies in various houses, though these interventions seemed to have little effect on the phenomena. The buildings themselves began to show signs of unusual deterioration. Paint peeled in patterns that resembled handprints or faces. Windows cracked without apparent cause, usually in spiderweb patterns radiating from central impact points where no impacts had occurred. Vegetation grew in unnatural configurations, flowers blooming out of season, trees bearing fruit at the wrong times, grass growing in perfect circles around houses where no seeds had been planted. Photographic equipment malfunctioned regularly in the compound. Digital cameras produced images with inexplicable anomalies, human figures in empty rooms, shadows that fell in impossible directions, faces appearing in reflective surfaces where no faces should have been. Professional photographers brought in to document the deterioration found their equipment consistently failing, with memory cards becoming corrupted and lenses developing fog that couldn't be cleaned. The most persistent phenomena occurred in the pediatric units, houses that had been home to doctors and nurses who worked primarily with children. These buildings generated sounds of childhood that were both heartbreaking and beautiful. Lullabies sung in languages that none of the maintenance staff recognized, the gentle sounds of children being read to, soft conversations between parents and sick children that seemed to echo from some parallel dimension where healing was always possible. Modern paranormal investigators who have gained permission to study the compound report that it represents one of the most active and complex haunting sites in East Africa. Unlike traditional African spiritual sites, which typically involve ancestral spirits connected to specific geographic locations, the KCMC village seems to harbour the consciousness of individuals who chose to make this foreign place their spiritual home. The haunting appears to be an expression of attachment rather than trauma, the persistent presence of people who loved this place too much to leave. Dr. Hoffman, now retired and living in Canada, maintains correspondence with colleagues who continue to study the phenomenon. In her recent papers, she has proposed that the KCMC haunting represents a new category of spiritual phenomenon, the creation of sacred space through service rather than ancestry. The medical staff who died while serving at the hospital may have transformed their residential compound into a kind of shrine to medical dedication, a place where their commitment to healing continues beyond death. The houses stand empty now, their windows dark, their gardens overgrown with vegetation that seems too green, too vibrant for the dry Tanzanian climate. Mount Kilimanjaro continues to watch over them, its snow-capped peak eternal and indifferent. But in the late afternoons, when the shadows grow long and the air grows thick with approaching darkness, visitors still report the sounds, children playing, doctors working, nurses singing lullabies to patients who will never grow old. The KCMC staff village endures as a testament to the possibility that love of service can transcend death, that some commitments run so deep they create their own form of immortality in the places where they were lived most fully. Varosha, Cyprus, the beach where time stopped. There is a fence that divides paradise from itself. On one side, the Mediterranean sparkles with the same azure brilliance that has drawn travellers for millennia, its waves caressing beaches of sand so fine it feels like silk between your toes. On the other side of that fence lies Varosha, a ghost resort where empty hotels stand sentinel over the same pristine coastline, their windows staring blindly at a sea that no longer knows the touch of human feet, where swimming pools have turned to stagnant mirrors reflecting skies that have witnessed nearly 50 years of abandonment. To understand Varosha, you must first understand what it was. Not merely a resort town, but a vision of what the future might hold. In the 1960s and early 1970s, this stretch of Cypriot coastline represented the cutting edge of Mediterranean tourism. The hotels that rose along Varosha's beaches were marvels of modernist architecture, their sleek lines and glass facades promising a new kind of vacation experience. The Argo Palace, the King George, the Florida Beach. These weren't just accommodations, but destinations in themselves, temples to leisure and luxury that attracted celebrities, politicians, and jet-setters from across Europe. Elizabeth Taylor stayed here. Brigitte Bardot sunbathed on these beaches. The nightclubs pulsed with music until dawn, their dance floors crowded with the beautiful and wealthy who had discovered this corner of Cyprus where ancient history met modern pleasure. Varosha was becoming the French Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean, a place where money could buy not just comfort but entrance into a lifestyle that seemed to promise eternal youth and endless summer. The architecture of those hotels tells a story of boundless optimism. Their designers believed they were building for a future that would only grow more prosperous, more cosmopolitan, more connected. The buildings stretched upward in confident verticals, their balconies cantilevered over infinity pools that seemed to merge with the sea itself. Glass curtain walls maximised views of the coastline, while rooftop restaurants offered panoramic vistas of both the Mediterranean and the Kyrenia Mountains, rising in purple majesty to the north. Local residents benefited enormously from this tourism boom. Families who had lived as farmers or fishermen for generations suddenly found themselves property owners in one of Europe's most desirable destinations. They opened restaurants serving traditional Cypriot food to international palates, converted their homes into small hotels, and watched their children learn languages and skills that would carry them into a globalized future. Varosha represented not just economic prosperity, but cultural evolution, a place where tradition and modernity could coexist in profitable harmony. The tourists who came to Varosha in those golden years were experiencing something unprecedented in the history of travel. Air conditioning made the summer heat bearable. International cuisine satisfied sophisticated palates, while local specialties provided authentic cultural experiences. Water sports, nightlife, shopping, and cultural excursions could be combined in packages that promised something for everyone. The infrastructure was world-class. Roads, utilities, communication systems that connected this Mediterranean paradise to capitals across Europe within hours. But beneath the surface of this prosperity lay tensions that the tourist boom had masked rather than resolved. Cyprus itself was a divided island, its Greek and Turkish populations locked in political struggles that dated back centuries. The success of Varosha, predominantly Greek Cypriot in ownership and character, became itself a source of tension. The wealth concentrated along this coastline stood in stark contrast to the economic struggles of other parts of the island. Success bred resentment. Prosperity created new forms of inequality. On July 15, 1974, everything changed in a single morning. A coup attempt by Greek Cypriot nationalists seeking union with Greece provided Turkey with the justification it had been seeking for military intervention. Turkish forces landed on Cyprus's northern coast, and within days the political geography of the island was redrawn with bullets and barbed wire. The coup failed, but its consequences proved irreversible. The Turkish advance toward Famagusta, the city that contained Varosha, triggered the largest refugee exodus in Cypriot history. Residents of the resort quarter had perhaps hours to gather what they could carry and flee southward. Hotel guests were evacuated by their respective embassies. Wealthy property owners abandoned mansions full of valuables. Restaurant owners left freezers full of food and safes full of cash. The exodus was so rapid and complete that many people left with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing, expecting to return within days once the temporary crisis had passed. The Turkish military cordoned off Varosha immediately after occupying it, creating a buffer zone that would prevent its use by either refugees hoping to return or military forces planning counterattacks. What was intended as a temporary security measure became a permanent barrier. The resort quarter was declared a closed military area, accessible only to Turkish military personnel and a handful of authorized investigators and journalists. The fence that was erected as an emergency measure became a permanent border between present and past. Within months, Varosha began its transformation from paradise to purgatory. The swimming pools, without maintenance, turned green and then black. The manicured gardens became jungles. The glass facades of the hotels, stressed by thermal expansion and contraction without climate control, began to crack and shatter. Nature started its slow but inexorable reclamation of what humans had built. The preservation of Varosha represents one of the most unusual archaeological sites in the modern world. Unlike ancient ruins that document civilizations lost to time, Varosha preserves a specific moment from the recent past with almost photographic precision. Cars from the 1970s sit in hotel parking lots, their tyres flat but their chrome still gleaming. Restaurant tables are set for meals that were never served. Hotel rooms retain their 1970s decor, shag carpets, geometric wallpaper, furniture in colours that epitomise the aesthetic of that era. The temporal preservation extends to commercial establishments throughout the district. Shop windows still display fashions from 1974. Miniskirts, wide lapel suits, platform shoes that were the height of style when time stopped here. Pharmacies contain medicines that are no longer manufactured. Newsstands hold papers with headlines announcing events that were breaking news half a century ago. The entire quarter has become an unintentional museum of the 1970s, preserved not by curatorial choice, but by political circumstance. Photography of Varosha from within the Forbidden Zone reveals details that are both fascinating and heartbreaking. Children's toys lie scattered in hotel lobbies where families were evacuated in panic. Suitcases sit unpacked in hotel rooms, their contents spilling onto floors where they have remained undisturbed for decades. Restaurant kitchens contain pots and pans, arranged exactly as they were when the last meals were being prepared on that July morning when everything changed. The ecological transformation of Varosha has created an entirely new ecosystem within the abandoned resort. Sea turtles, no longer disturbed by beachgoers, have returned to nest on beaches that were once crowded with sunbathers. Wild vegetation has colonized swimming pools, creating unlikely wetlands in the heart of concrete jungle. Birds nest in the upper floors of hotels, their songs echoing through corridors that once rang with human voices. From observation points along the fence that surrounds Varosha, visitors can see the ghostly outlines of the abandoned hotels against the brilliant blue of the Mediterranean. The view is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Pristine beaches stretching into the distance, unmarred by development but also untouched by life. The contrast between the vibrant tourist activity just outside the fence and the deathly quiet within creates a visual metaphor for the arbitrary nature of political boundaries and their power to transform paradise into purgatory. International efforts to resolve Cyprus's division have consistently identified Varosha as a key element in any comprehensive settlement. The return of the quarter to its original inhabitants and the restoration of its tourism infrastructure could serve as a confidence-building measure and economic incentive for peace. Yet nearly 50 years of negotiations have failed to achieve the political breakthrough that would unlock the gates and allow life to return to these abandoned streets. The residents who fled Varosha in 1974 have grown old in exile, many passing away without ever seeing their homes again. Their children and grandchildren have been raised on stories of a paradise lost, a homeland that exists primarily in memory and faded photographs. Property deeds and house keys are passed down through families like sacred relics, tangible connections to a place that remains tantalizingly visible but legally unreachable. Recent developments have raised new possibilities for Varosha's future. Limited sections of the quarter have been opened for controlled tourism, allowing visitors to walk through streets that have been frozen in time for half a century. These tentative steps toward normalizing access raise hopes that broader reopening might be possible, but they also raise questions about what form any restoration should take. Should Varosha be rebuilt as a modern resort or preserved as a historical monument to the cost of political division? Standing at the fence that separates accessible Cyprus from forbidden Varosha, watching the Mediterranean waves crash against beaches where no footprints mark the sand, visitors confront fundamental questions about the relationship between place and time, between politics and human belonging. The resort quarter endures as a reminder that paradise can be lost in a single day, but also as evidence that some forms of beauty are too powerful to be destroyed entirely. They can only be put behind fences where they wait with infinite patience for the gates to open once again. The stories we have uncovered may never yield all their answers. Some truths might forever elude us, lost in the shadows of time and silence. Yet in our search, guided not by certainty but by wonder, we pay tribute to the lives and dreams intertwined with these forgotten places. We join a timeless journey, the human drive to seek meaning beyond the visible, to bridge the past with the future, and to find connection where only ruins remain. For now, these places stand as monuments to the unknown. Their secrets whisper through empty halls and overgrown paths, inviting us to listen, to imagine, and to remember. They remind us that history is not simply what is recorded, but what endures in absence, in mystery, and in the spaces between. The vanished towns, the abandoned homes, the silent ruins, they endure, as do the questions they inspire. And in their endurance, they continue to speak across the ages, echoing the eternal human quest to understand the world and ourselves.